There's something about the silence out here on the farm that always unnerved me, especially when I'm alone. Maybe it's the vastness, the way the wind whistles through the trees, or the way the old wooden house creaks and groans as if it's alive. Joe, my brother, and his wife, Clara, had gone out of town for the weekend to visit Clara's parents. That left me alone to tend to the animals, the crops, and the house. I wasn't complaining. I liked the solitude sometimes, but there was always that underlying tension in the air, something you can't quite put your finger on. It was a chilly October evening, and the wind had picked up, rattling the shutters of the old farmhouse. I had just finished dinner and was settling in for the night when I heard it, a scream. It wasn't just any scream, though. It was a sound that made my blood run cold, like nothing I'd ever heard before. It came from somewhere deep in the cornfield, a long, drawn-out wail of pure terror, the kind that cuts through you and leaves you frozen. At first, I thought it might be a coyote, maybe even a prank by some local kids. But then I heard it again, clearer this time, and there was no mistaking it, a woman's scream, desperate and raw. My heart started racing, and every instinct in my body told me to stay inside, lock the doors, and wait for it to pass. But then I heard her voice, distant but unmistakable, pleading for help. I stood at the window, staring into the dark abyss of the cornfield. The tall, dry stalks swayed with the wind, and I could barely see beyond the first few rows. Every logical part of me said to stay put, but something else, something primal, compelled me to act. I grabbed Joe's old rifle from the closet, a beat-up thing he'd used for hunting over the years, and loaded around, just in case. My hands trembled as I opened the front door, stepping out into the cold night. The wind was harsher out here, carrying with it a scent of decay, the smell of the crops slowly dying with the season. I could still hear her, faint but there, calling for help from the cornfield. I took a deep breath and aimed the rifle towards the sky, firing a warning shot. The blast echoed through the empty fields, but the scream didn't stop. If anything, it grew more frantic, more desperate. "Who's out there?" I yelled, but my voice was swallowed by the night. No response. I ran back inside, my pulse pounding in my ears. I called 911, my voice shaky as I tried to explain what I'd heard. The dispatcher asked all the usual questions, how long ago, where I was located, and assured me that they'd send a squad car over. In the meantime, she told me to stay inside and lock the doors. It wasn't long before 2 officers arrived, their lights casting an eerie glow on the rows of corn. They searched the field, shining their flashlights into the thick stalks. I stood on the porch, watching, my gut churning. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. But after what felt like hours, they came back empty-handed. "Nothing out there," one of the officers said, wiping his brow. "Could have been an animal. Or maybe someone playing a prank. These old fields carry sounds strange sometimes." I nodded, but I didn't believe him. The scream had been too real, too human. "If you hear anything else, don't hesitate to call us back," the other officer said as they got into their car and drove off into the night. I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, trying to steady my breathing. The house was quiet again, but that scream lingered in my mind, like an echo I couldn't shake. I paced the living room, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was it really just a prank? Or had someone really been out there, in trouble, and I hadn't done enough? As the hours passed, I started to convince myself that maybe the police were right. Maybe it was just a trick of the wind, or some animal in distress. But then, sometime after midnight, I heard something else, a soft creak from downstairs. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't expecting anyone, and Joe had made it clear that no one else should be around. I grabbed the shotgun we kept by the bed and slowly made my way downstairs, my feet barely making a sound on the old wooden steps. The house was dark, save for the faint moonlight streaming in through the windows. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw it, a tall, lanky figure, standing in the shadows by the front door. My blood turned to ice. The figure wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. "Who the hell are you?" I shouted, raising the shotgun. The figure didn't respond. I could barely make out its features in the dim light, but I could tell it wasn't right. Too tall, too thin, like something out of a nightmare. I took a step forward, and as soon as I did, the figure bolted for the door, flinging it open and disappearing into the night. I ran after it, but by the time I got outside, it was gone, swallowed by the darkness and the corn. I called the police again, breathless and panicked, and they came back out. Once more, they found nothing, no sign of forced entry, no footprints, nothing to suggest anyone had been inside. They assured me it was probably just my nerves, maybe even a trick of the light. But I knew what I saw. And I knew something, or someone, had been in my house. I didn't sleep that night, sitting in the living room with the shotgun across my lap, every creak of the house setting me on edge. I kept replaying the scream, the figure in the shadows, over and over in my head, trying to make sense of it. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly, horribly wrong. Days passed, but the unease never left me. Joe and Clara came back, and I told them what had happened. Joe tried to laugh it off, saying it was probably just a couple of kids messing around, but I could tell he didn't entirely believe that either. The scream, the figure in the house, it weighed on me, like a dark cloud that wouldn't lift. A few days later, Joe and I were out in the fields, finishing up the harvest. I'd almost managed to push the whole thing to the back of my mind when I saw something. It was barely visible at first, half buried in the dirt between the rows of corn. A shoe. Not just any shoe, a woman's shoe. I froze, staring at it, my heart hammering in my chest. All the memories from that night came flooding back in a rush. The shoe sat there, half buried in the soil like some forgotten relic. I stared at it, feeling the blood drain from my face. My breath caught in my throat as a wave of nausea swept over me. It was small, black, and worn, the kind of shoe someone might wear for a night out, certainly not something you'd expect to find in the middle of a cornfield. "Joe!" I called out, my voice hoarse. He was a few rows over, busy with the harvest, but when he heard the tone in my voice, he dropped what he was doing and hurried over. His brows furrowed when he saw me crouching by the shoe. "What is it?" he asked, wiping his hands on his jeans. I pointed at the ground, too stunned to speak. Joe followed my gaze and knelt down beside me, picking up the shoe with a puzzled expression. "The hell?" he muttered, turning it over in his hands. This wasn't here before, was it?" I shook my head. "No way. I've been through this part of the field a dozen times. This wasn't here." Joe stood up, brushing dirt off his hands, but I could tell he was just as unsettled as I was. His eyes flicked from the shoe to the rows of corn swaying in the breeze. For a moment, we both just stood there, staring at the empty fields around us, the silence between us heavy with unspoken fears. "You think it's connected?" Joe finally asked, his voice low. I didn't need to ask what he meant. The scream. The figure in the house. The eerie, unsettling feeling that had been hanging over the farm since that night. I nodded slowly, my mouth dry. There was no denying it now. Something had happened here, something terrible. "We need to call the police," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Joe hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, I guess so. But what if it's just a coincidence? I mean, it's just a shoe." "It's not just a shoe, Joe," I snapped, frustration and fear bubbling up inside me. "You heard that scream. You know something's wrong. What if—" I trailed off, unable to finish the thought. What if someone had been out there that night, hurt or worse? What if we had missed the only chance to help them? Joe sighed and nodded, pulling out his phone. "All right, I'll call them." The police arrived about an hour later, the same officers from before. They didn't look too happy to be back, especially over something as seemingly trivial as a shoe, but they took it seriously enough. They bagged the shoe as evidence and asked us the usual questions, when we found it, if we'd seen anything strange in the past few days. I told them about the figure in the house again, but just like last time, they didn't find any signs of forced entry. No footprints, no broken locks. It was like whoever had been in the house had vanished without a trace. "I'm not saying it's impossible," one of the officers said, trying to sound reassuring. But there haven't been any reports of a missing person in the area, and without more to go on, there's not much we can do. So what are we supposed to do? I asked, feeling helpless. If you find anything else, anything at all, call us immediately. And if it'll make you feel better, we can have someone patrol the area for the next few nights. I nodded, but their words did little to comfort me. The shoe, the scream, the figure in the house, they haunted me. Even with the police patrolling, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something, that something terrible had happened right under our noses. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house made my heart race. I kept imagining that tall, thin figure standing at the bottom of the stairs, watching, waiting. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows at least 5 times, but it didn't help. Something was out there, and I could feel it, like an itch at the back of my mind that wouldn't go away. The next morning, Joe and I returned to the fields to finish the harvest. I tried to keep my mind on the work, but my eyes kept drifting to the rows of corn, half expecting to see someone or something lurking just out of sight. Every rustle of the wind through the stalks sent a shiver down my spine. It was late in the afternoon when I heard Joe's voice again, this time more urgent. "Hey, come here! You need to see this!" I dropped what I was doing and rushed over, my stomach already in knots. Joe was standing by the edge of the field, near the tree line, his face pale. "Look," he said, pointing at the ground. At first, I didn't see it, but as I looked closer, I realized what he was pointing at, a shallow indentation in the dirt. It looked like a footprint. Not just any footprint though. It was too large, too deep, and the shape of it was wrong. It was elongated, almost like someone had been dragging their feet. "I don't like this," Joe muttered, shaking his head. "Not one bit." We followed the footprints, our hearts pounding in our chests. They led us deeper into the field, weaving between the rows of corn in a strange, erratic pattern. Every step we took felt heavier, like we were walking towards something we didn't want to find. The footprints led us to a clearing, where the corn had been trampled down into the dirt. And there, in the center of the clearing, was something that made my blood run cold. It was a patch of dried blood, smeared across the ground, mixed with bits of broken corn stalks and dirt. My knees went weak, and for a moment I thought I might pass out. "Oh God!" Joe whispered, his voice barely audible. We stood there in stunned silence, staring at the blood stain, neither of us daring to move. It felt like the whole world had stopped, like we were standing on the edge of some dark, horrible secret. "We need to call the police," I said again, my voice shaky. Joe didn't argue this time. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911, his hands trembling. When the police arrived, they cordoned off the area and began searching the field more thoroughly. I watched them from a distance, my stomach in knots, praying they would find something, or maybe nothing at all. I didn't know what to hope for anymore. Hours passed, and as the sun began to set, one of the officers approached us. "We've found more footprints," he said, his face grim. "But they disappear near the tree line. And there's no body, no sign of anyone injured or missing. We'll have to run some tests on the blood, but for now, we don't have much to go on." "So what does that mean?" I asked, my voice hollow. "It means we'll keep investigating," he replied. "But for now, there's nothing more we can do." Joe and I watched as they packed up and left, leaving us standing in the field, the weight of the discovery hanging heavy in the air. The next few days passed in a blur. The police came and went, asking more questions, searching for clues, but nothing else turned up. No body, no missing person reports, nothing to explain the blood, the footprints, or the scream. The farm felt different after that. The once peaceful, quiet fields now felt ominous, haunted by whatever had happened that night. Every time I walked through the rows of corn, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that whatever, or whoever, had been out there was still lurking, waiting. And the worst part was, I knew we would never truly know what had happened. We would never get the answers we needed. But the fear, the unease, that would never go away. Growing up, My brothers and I spent most of our summers at our family's vacation home in a little town called Hollywood, South Carolina. It wasn't anything fancy, just a mobile home on the edge of some farmland, surrounded by woods that seemed to stretch for miles. The kind of place where you could disappear into the quiet for hours. Our parents loved it for the peace and quiet, but for us, it was an endless playground. The fields, the woods, and the scattered old buildings made it feel like our own private world to explore. My brothers, Luca, the oldest, then me, Oren, and my two younger brothers, Jasper and Iver, would always spend our time outside, climbing trees, running through the woods, and making up games to pass the long summer days. Our favorite, though, was hide and seek. We'd pick one of us to be the seeker, and the rest would scatter like shadows across the property, hiding in all the nooks and crannies the land had to offer. But there was one place we always dared each other to explore, the abandoned house about half a mile from our home. It sat on the edge of a cornfield, a small, dilapidated building that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. No one ever talked about it, but something about that place made my skin crawl even in broad daylight. One summer afternoon, when the air was thick with the scent of crops and the buzzing of cicadas, we decided to play hide and seek near that house. We'd never gone that far from the mobile home before, but being kids, we didn't think twice about it. Luca was the seeker that day. As the oldest, he always played his part with more intensity, making everything feel like a real adventure. He started counting with his eyes closed, leaning against one of the old fence posts near the road. 1, 2, 3. Luca's voice drifted as the rest of us darted off. I ran straight for the cornfield, its tall, green stalks forming a perfect hiding place. The corn was thick and rustled with every step, and I felt safe there, knowing I could move around without being seen. I crouched down, catching my breath, and waited for Luca to come looking. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the field, but the thrill of the game kept my nerves in check. That's when I heard it, the soft crunch of footsteps on the dry ground behind me. At first I thought it was Luca, so I stayed perfectly still, holding my breath. But something was off. The footsteps weren't hurried or deliberate like his would have been. They were slow, almost hesitant, like whoever, or whatever, was walking didn't want to be heard. I turned my head slowly, peeking between the stalks. All I saw was the endless maze of corn, waving gently in the breeze. But the sound continued, getting closer. My heart raced. Luca couldn't have found me so quickly, and I knew Iver and Jasper were hiding somewhere else. I decided to make a break for it, figuring I could run to the shed near the house and hide there instead. I bolted from the cornfield, my feet pounding against the dirt as I reached the small, weathered shed. I crouched down behind it, breathing hard, waiting for the footsteps to fade. But they didn't. They stopped. I glanced back toward the field, half expecting to see Luca grinning, ready to tag me. But he wasn't there. No one was. The corn rustled in the breeze, but the footsteps had stopped as soon as I left the field. It was like whatever had been following me disappeared the moment I stepped out. Something wasn't right. A few minutes later, I heard Luca shouting, "Got you!" as he found Jasper and Iver near the house. I came out of my hiding spot, still shaken by what I'd heard. We all regrouped, laughing and bickering about who had the best hiding spot. I kept my mouth shut about the footsteps. Maybe I was just imagining things. As we walked back home, the sky turning a dusky purple, I asked Luca if he'd been near the cornfield. "Nah, I stayed closer to the house," he said. "Why?" "No reason," I mumbled, not wanting to seem paranoid. That night, when we got back to the mobile home, Dad was sitting on the porch, smoking his usual after-dinner cigarette. We told him about our game, how we'd played near the abandoned house. He frowned. "No one's lived in that place for years," he said, almost as if he was talking to himself. A cold shiver ran down my spine. No one lived there? Then what, or who, had I heard in the cornfield? The rest of that evening was uneventful. We ate dinner, watched TV, and eventually crawled into our bunks, exhausted from the day. But as I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching us. Something that wasn't one of my brothers. The next day, though, the weirdness of the previous evening was pushed aside by the thrill of another adventure. We decided we were going back to that old house, this time after dark. It was Luca's idea, of course. He was always the brave one, the leader who got us into all kinds of trouble. And being his younger brother, I wasn't about to back down. But Iver, the youngest, didn't want to come. He was only 8 at the time, and nights in the country can be pitch black, the kind of darkness that swallows everything whole. So, it was just the 3 of us, Luca, Jasper, and me, armed with flashlights, as we made our way through the woods toward the cornfield again. I could feel the tension between us. It wasn't just the excitement of playing in the dark, it was something more, something heavier. Maybe it was because we all knew, deep down, that there was something strange about that place. The night air was thick, the kind of stillness that amplifies every sound. We could hear our footsteps crunching on the gravel road as we walked back toward the abandoned house. I held my flashlight tightly, its beam cutting through the dark, revealing only more shadows ahead. Luca led the way, of course, with Jasper following close behind. As we neared the house, I hesitated. There was a feeling in the pit of my stomach that something wasn't right, but I couldn't place it. Luca stopped at the edge of the cornfield, grinning at me and Jasper. "All right, you guys ready for flashlight tag?" We nodded, but I could sense the unease in Jasper's expression. He glanced toward the dark rows of corn, the stalks swaying slightly in the night breeze. I tried to shake off my own nerves. It was just a game. Luca held up his flashlight, the beam flickering as he waved it toward the old house. "All right, I'll be the seeker this time," he said. His voice was steady, but I could tell he was just as keyed up as the rest of us. There was something about playing in the dark that made everything feel different, more dangerous, like the shadows themselves had grown teeth. "Count to 50, I said, trying to hide the tremor in my voice. Luca nodded, and without another word, Jasper and I ran off in different directions. I glanced over my shoulder as Luca pressed his hands to his face and started counting aloud. 1, 2, 3. I bolted for the cornfield. Something inside me told me it was a bad idea, but my legs carried me there anyway. The tall stalks loomed like silent sentinels, their leaves whispering in the breeze. Once I was deep enough inside, I crouched down, the soil damp beneath me. The darkness felt alive around me, the rows of corn creating a maze that twisted in every direction. The flashlight in my hand seemed weak, almost useless, as I turned it off to avoid being seen. The air smelled of earth and something else, something faintly metallic. I tried to focus on Luca's counting in the distance, but every little noise made me jump. The wind moved through the corn, a low rustle that sounded too much like footsteps. For a moment, I considered running back to the house, calling it quits. Maybe I could hide near the shed again, like the day before. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Not Luca's. His would have been faster, more deliberate. These were slow, dragging almost, as if someone was moving cautiously through the field. My heart began to race, each beat pounding in my ears. I stayed perfectly still, hoping whatever it was would pass by without noticing me. But the footsteps kept getting closer. I slowly flicked on my flashlight, pointing it toward the direction of the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a narrow path between the stalks. I scanned back and forth, expecting to see Luca's face pop out, grinning. But there was no one. The footsteps stopped as soon as my light hit the area. I held my breath, staring into the shadows. The quiet was oppressive, like the entire world was holding its breath with me. Then I saw it. A figure, just at the edge of my light's reach. It wasn't moving toward me, just standing there. I couldn't make out much, only that it was tall, a man maybe, but something about the way he stood made my skin crawl. His head tilted slightly, as if he were watching me. I stepped back, my heart slamming against my ribs. "Luca?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, unmoving. And then, in the silence, I heard a voice. It was soft, almost a whisper, but clear enough that it sent a chill down my spine. "Can I play with you guys?" I froze, the words hanging in the air, each syllable dripping with something dark and wrong. The figure took a step forward, just one, and I saw the flash of something pale in the light. A face, deformed, or maybe it was a mask. I couldn't tell. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing fast enough. I turned and ran. I didn't care about the game anymore. I didn't care about Luca or Jasper. I just ran as fast as I could, crashing through the corn, the stalks tearing at my skin as I bolted toward the house. I could hear footsteps behind me now, faster, louder, like the thing was chasing me. I didn't dare look back. Every part of me was focused on getting out of that field. When I burst out into the clearing, I nearly ran straight into Jasper, who was hiding near the old shed. "Oren, what the hell?" he started, but I grabbed his arm, yanking him toward the road. "We need to go," I gasped, barely able to form the words. "No." Jasper didn't argue. He must have seen the panic in my eyes, because he immediately dropped his flashlight and followed me. We ran back toward the mobile home, my legs burning with every step. Behind us, the cornfield was silent again, but I knew that thing, whatever it was still out there. We didn't stop until we reached the porch, both of us panting and out of breath. Luca arrived moments later, confused and irritated. "What the hell? I wasn't done counting." I stared at him, my chest still heaving. "There was someone in the cornfield." Luca frowned. "What are you talking about?" "I saw him," I insisted. "He was just standing there." He asked if he could play with us. Luca's face went pale. "That's not funny, Oren." "I'm not joking," I snapped, my voice shaking. "I'm telling you, there was someone else out there." Jasper looked between us, his eyes wide with fear. "We shouldn't have gone back there." "I knew it." We hurried inside, locking the door behind us. When we told our parents what happened, they were confused at first, then concerned. My dad frowned, listening carefully as I described what I'd seen. But when I mentioned the voice, the way it whispered that awful question, his face darkened. He didn't say anything right away, just told us to stay inside for the rest of the night. The next morning, he was unusually quiet, but I noticed him and Mom having a hushed conversation. After that, they wouldn't let us go near the old house again. Dad even boarded up the back door, saying it was to keep the critters out. But I knew better. We never saw that figure again, but the memory haunted me for years. Eventually, we sold the vacation home, and I never went back to Hollywood, South Carolina. It was Darren's idea to head out to his family's rural property in Michigan. We'd been talking about getting away for a weekend, doing something a little adventurous but still within driving distance. Off-roading through the woods, camping under the stars, something simple. I hadn't been out there before, but Darren had spent a lot of summers at the place, so he knew the area well. The property was vast, bordered by thick woods on one side and endless fields on the other. Darren said it was quiet, really remote. Not much around except for a couple of abandoned barns and an old church that had been out of use for as long as he could remember. He'd mentioned the church offhand, like it was no big deal. In fact, the thought of exploring a forgotten, decaying church actually sounded intriguing to me. There's something about abandoned places that sparks curiosity. We packed light, a couple of bags with the usual supplies, some food, water, flashlights, and just enough beer to make the nights more fun. The drive out to the property was long and uneventful, the roads narrowing into dirt paths as we got deeper into the countryside. By the time we arrived, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting an orange glow over the fields. It was beautiful, in that eerie, middle-of-nowhere kind of way. Darren's family owned a small cabin on the property. Nothing fancy, just one story with a couple of bedrooms, a kitchen, and a living room with an old wood-burning stove. The kind of place that would feel cozy if you weren't aware of how far away it was from the next house. After unloading our stuff, Darren suggested we go out for a ride before it got completely dark. The trails were rough but manageable, and for the first hour or so, we had a blast. We tore through the forest, the sound of the ATV engines echoing off the trees. There was a thrill in the air, the kind you get when you're far from civilization with no one around to tell you what to do. Eventually, we found ourselves near the church Darren had mentioned. It sat at the edge of the woods, isolated and decaying, surrounded by waist-high weeds. The structure was old, very old. Its white paint had long since chipped away, leaving only traces of the color it once had. The steeple was crooked, and the windows were either broken or boarded up. Something about it made me uneasy, but I didn't want to show it. After all, I'd come here for adventure, right? "Let's check it out," Darren said, his voice filled with excitement. He grabbed his flashlight and gestured for me to follow. I hesitated, just for a second, but curiosity got the better of me. We parked the ATVs near the church, and as we approached, the place seemed even more foreboding. The silence was thick, the kind that makes the air feel heavy. The front doors were slightly ajar, creaking on their rusty hinges as Darren pushed one open. The inside was worse than I expected. Dust floated in the beam of our flashlights, and the pews were scattered as if something had ransacked the place. A musty, damp smell filled the air, making the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. "Creepy as hell," I muttered. Darren chuckled. "Yeah, but it's kind of cool, right?" I wasn't so sure. There was something off about the church, something I couldn't put my finger on. Maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to move just out of the corner of my eye, or the oppressive quiet that seemed to suffocate every sound we made. We walked deeper into the church, our footsteps echoing through the empty space. We stopped at the altar, where a tattered old Bible sat untouched, its pages yellowed with age. Darren was looking around, shining his flashlight into the corners, when something caught my eye. I turned toward one of the broken windows near the back of the church and froze. There, sitting in one of the pews, was a figure. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but as I focused, I saw it clearly, a person, or something that resembled a person, hunched over in the shadows. Its face was obscured, and its posture was unnatural, like it had been sitting there for years. "Darren," I whispered, my throat suddenly dry. He didn't hear me, too busy examining the Bible. I grabbed his arm and yanked him toward me. "Look!" He swung his flashlight in the direction I was pointing, and the beam landed directly on the figure. For a split second, either of us moved. The thing didn't react to the light, it just sat there, unmoving. It was dressed in tattered clothes, its skin pale and gaunt. I couldn't see its face, but the way it was positioned, it didn't feel right. "Maybe it's a mannequin?" Darren said, though his voice lacked any real conviction. "I don't think so," I replied, my heart pounding in my chest. Something about it felt too real. Too wrong. We both stood there for what felt like an eternity, unsure of what to do next. Then, without warning, the figure shifted. It didn't move like a person would, it was jerky, almost mechanical. And then, before either of us could react, it stood up. The light from our flashlights flickered for a moment, and in that brief second of darkness, the figure was gone. "Did you see that?" I gasped, stumbling backward. My heart was racing now, panic setting in. Yeah, let's get out of here," Darren muttered, his excitement from earlier completely gone. We didn't bother looking for the figure again. We bolted for the door, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we ran through the empty church. My stomach churned with fear, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run faster. We made it back to the ATVs, breathless and shaken. Neither of us spoke as we started the engines and tore out of there, the sound of the roaring motors doing little to ease the tension. As we rode back to the cabin, I couldn't shake the image of that figure, sitting in the church, waiting in the dark. What the hell was it? And why did it disappear like that? That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the wind outside made me jump. Darren was quiet too, his usual carefree attitude completely gone. Something had happened in that church, something we couldn't explain. And deep down, I knew that whatever it wasn't over yet. I hardly slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes I saw the figure from the church, its pale, gaunt form shifting unnaturally in the shadows. The stillness of the cabin didn't help. It was as if the darkness outside was alive, pressing in on the windows, waiting for something. Every creak, every distant howl of wind made my heart race. Darren, usually the guy who slept like a rock, was up too. I could hear him shifting in his bed across the small cabin. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the first light broke through the trees, I felt a small sense of relief. The fear that had gripped me the night before didn't seem as overwhelming in the daylight. But there was still that lingering unease, like the shadow of a nightmare that refused to fade. "We need to check that place again," Darren said over breakfast, his voice unusually serious. He was staring out the window, his eyes distant. "There has to be some explanation. Maybe it was just a homeless guy or someone messing with us." I wanted to argue, to say that going back was a terrible idea, but part of me was just as curious as Darren. I needed to know what we had seen. I needed some kind of explanation to make the fear go away. So, later that afternoon, we geared up again, flashlights, a couple of beers for courage, and Darren even grabbed an old hunting knife his dad had left at the cabin. "Just in case," he said with a weak smile. We hopped on the ATVs and headed back toward the church. This time, the ride felt different. The excitement from the day before had been replaced with a heavy sense of dread. The church looked the same as it had the night before, silent, decaying, with its windows broken and doors hanging on by a thread. But in the daylight, it didn't seem as terrifying. It was just an old, abandoned building. For a moment, I almost convinced myself that what we saw last night was a trick of the light, maybe our own imaginations playing tricks on us after a couple of beers. But then we stepped inside. The musty smell hit me again, that same damp, rotting odor that had made me feel sick the night before. The sunlight streamed in through the broken windows, casting long shadows on the dusty floor. It was easier to see now, but that didn't make me feel any better. In fact, it made things worse. The figure was gone. "See? Probably nothing," Darren said, though I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. He walked over to the pew where the figure had been sitting, shining his flashlight on the spot as if expecting to see some kind of clue. There was nothing, just dust and decay. But something didn't feel right. My stomach churned with that same sickening feeling from the night before. I scanned the room, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow. And then I saw it, movement. Just a flicker at the edge of my vision, near the back of the church. "Darren," I whispered, but before I could finish, there was a loud crash. We both jumped, spinning toward the noise. The crash echoed through the old church, reverberating off the cracked walls and sending my pulse racing. Darren and I froze, hearts hammering in our chests. For a moment, neither of us moved, paralyzed by the sudden sound. It had come from the back of the church, near the boarded-up door that led to some long-forgotten room. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding in my ears. Darren didn't answer right away. His face was pale, and his grip on the flashlight tightened until his knuckles went white. "Yeah, I heard it," he muttered, his eyes locked on the dark corner where the sound had come from. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the church was dead silent again, as if nothing had ever disturbed it. The stillness made the air feel heavier, pressing down on us, suffocating. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, to run as far from this place as I could, but Darren took a step forward. "Maybe it's just some animal," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. I swallowed hard, trying to push down the rising tide of fear. "I don't think that was an animal, Darren. We should just go." "No." But Darren, being Darren, wasn't one to back down easily. He took another step toward the back of the church, shining his flashlight into the shadows. "Come on, we've come this far. Let's just check it out real quick, then we'll leave." I didn't want to follow him, but I also didn't want to be left standing alone in the middle of that cursed place. So, reluctantly, I stayed close behind him as we edged toward the back of the church. As we got closer, the stench of rot grew stronger. It was suffocating now, the smell thick in the air, making me gag. Darren pulled up the loose boards covering the door at the back, revealing a narrow hallway behind it, leading deeper into the building. The air inside was cold, unnaturally so, and my skin prickled as I followed him down the dark passage. The hallway led to a small room, barely big enough to be called a room at all. It looked like some kind of storage area. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floor, and the walls were lined with old, decaying wooden shelves. Darren swept his flashlight around the room, but there was no sign of anyone or anything. "See? There's nothing here," he said, though the tension in his voice betrayed him. Just as I was about to agree and suggest we leave, something moved behind us. We both spun around, and that's when I saw it. Standing at the entrance to the hallway was the figure. It was the same thing we had seen the night before, pale, gaunt, its face obscured by the shadows. But now, in the dim light of the flashlight, I could see more details. Its clothes were torn and filthy, hanging loosely from its skeletal frame. And its eyes... God, its eyes were hollow, deep pits of darkness that seemed to pull the light out of the room. It didn't move like a normal person. Instead, it stood there, rigid, as if it were waiting for something. My heart stopped, and for a moment, the world seemed to freeze. Then it lunged. "Run!" I screamed, pushing Darren out of the way. We bolted back down the narrow hallway, our flashlights bouncing wildly, the beam of light flickering as we stumbled through the darkness. Behind us, I could hear the figure's footsteps, slow and deliberate, like it knew we had nowhere to go. We burst out into the main hall of the church, sprinting toward the front doors. I could feel the thing behind us, closing in, its presence pressing against my back like a cold wind. Darren reached the door first, yanking it open with a loud creak. We tumbled outside, stumbling over the uneven ground as we ran toward the ATVs. "Go, go, go!" I shouted, practically leaping onto my ATV. Darren was right behind me, and within seconds, we were speeding down the trail, the engines roaring as we tore through the trees. I didn't dare look back. I didn't want to know if it was still following us. The ride back to the cabin was a blur. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode, and my hands shook as I gripped the handlebars. Every shadow in the trees felt like it was watching us, waiting for us to slow down. But we didn't stop. Not until we reached the cabin. We skidded to a stop outside the front door, both of us panting and drenched in sweat. Darren looked at me, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. "What the hell was that?" he gasped, leaning against the cabin for support. I didn't have an answer. All I could do was shake my head, my mind still reeling from what we had just experienced. That thing, whatever it wasn't human. I didn't know how to explain it, but there was no doubt in my mind now. We had seen something unnatural, something wrong. "We're not going back there," I finally managed to say, my voice trembling. "No way in hell," Darren agreed, his usual bravado completely gone. That night, we barricaded ourselves inside the cabin, locking every door and window, though deep down, we both knew it wouldn't matter if the thing decided to come for us. The hours dragged on, and sleep was impossible. Every noise outside, every gust of wind, every creak of the cabin, made me jump, convinced that it was coming for us. At dawn, we called Darren's dad. We didn't tell him everything, just that something strange had happened at the church and that we didn't feel safe. He was already on his way up to the property, so it didn't take him long to arrive. When he got there, we told him the whole story, about the figure, the noises, the chase. I could see the disbelief in his eyes, but there was also concern. He didn't brush us off or laugh it away like I expected him to. Instead, he said, "Let's go take a look." Despite everything, I felt a small sliver of relief. Maybe with him there, we'd get some answers. Maybe it was just some drifter, some lost soul who'd been hiding in the church. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. When we arrived at the church again, it was exactly as we'd left it, silent, decaying, and abandoned. Darren's dad walked through the building, checking every corner, every room. And then, just as he was about to call it quits, he froze, staring at something on the floor. There, in the dust, were footprints. They weren't ours. They led from the back of the church to the door, and then they stopped. Like the figure had vanished into thin air. Darren's dad looked at us, his face pale, the same fear we'd felt the night before creeping into his eyes. "We're leaving," he said quietly. "Now." We never talked about the church after that. We didn't want to. Whatever we saw that night, it wasn't something that belonged in our world. And we weren't going to stick around to find out what it wanted. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls through the trees, I think about that figure. And I wonder if it's still there, sitting in that abandoned church, waiting for someone else to find it. You know, I never considered myself the kind of guy who'd end up in a situation straight out of a horror movie. But sometimes life throws you into something that feels so unreal, you almost can't believe it's happening. Let me tell you about the time I thought I was just heading up for a peaceful weekend in Vermont, and ended up in the most terrifying night of my life. It started like any other weekend trip. My buddy Adam had a cabin up in the mountains, near this small town called Stowe in Vermont. He'd been planning a skiing weekend for months, and we'd talked about it over a dozen beers, picturing a weekend of skiing, bonfires, and just unwinding from the grind. I had an old Ford F-150, reliable as hell. Well, at least I thought it was. The weather was supposed to be rough, but nothing I hadn't driven through before. Heavy snowstorms? Not a big deal, right? Just part of the Vermont charm. I left Brooklyn late Friday afternoon, and I knew I'd be getting to Adam's place well after dark. It was a solid 5-hour drive, and while the first few hours were easy, by the time I hit the smaller roads in Vermont, the snow started coming down harder. The windshield wipers worked overtime, and the headlights barely pierced through the thick curtain of snow. Still, the truck was handling it fine, and I felt like I was on track to make it there without a hitch. About 45 minutes away from the cabin, on a long stretch of isolated road, the truck's dashboard lit up. Engine overheating. I remember staring at the warning light for a second, almost as if I could will it to go away, but the steam rising from the hood told me I wasn't getting out of this one. I pulled over to the side of the road and popped the hood, stepping out into the freezing cold. Sure enough, steam was hissing from the engine, and I knew right away this wasn't something I could fix on the spot. The snow was coming down even harder now, and I could barely see a few feet in front of me. I got back inside the truck, cranked the heat, and tried to figure out my options. No cell service, of course. I was deep in the middle of nowhere, and the idea of walking for miles in the freezing cold, through a snowstorm, wasn't appealing. The only thing I could do was keep the engine running enough to stay warm, without pushing it too hard. I figured I'd wait for a car to pass by and flag them down. It seemed like a solid plan, except for one problem. Not a single car came by for what felt like hours. Finally, just when I was starting to worry, I saw headlights cutting through the storm. A small car, maybe a Toyota, pulled up alongside me. I jumped out, waving my arms to get their attention, and a guy rolled down his window. He looked to be in his 40s, bundled up in a heavy coat, and seemed friendly enough. I asked if he had a phone I could use, explaining the whole situation. He handed me his phone, and I quickly called Adam to let him know I was stuck. Then I called a local towing company, arranged for them to come get me, and handed the phone back to the guy. "Thanks, man. I really appreciate it," I said, trying to stay calm even though the situation had me on edge. "No problem," he replied, giving me a strange look before he rolled up his window and drove off into the night. I got back into my truck, now with at least some hope of rescue on the way. I turned off the headlights and sat in the dark for a while, just watching the snow fall. It was one of those nights where the sky was pitch black, and the only light came from the occasional gust of wind blowing snow around. After a few minutes, the silence became almost unbearable. To kill time, I pulled out my phone and started playing some stupid game, anything to distract me from how utterly alone I felt out there. 20 minutes passed, maybe more, when I heard it. A loud thump against the passenger side window. My heart skipped a beat, and I fumbled for my flashlight. I shined it toward the window, and nearly jumped out of my skin. There was a man standing right outside, slamming his hands against the glass. He was wearing a thick black coat, the hood pulled up tight around his face, but I could see enough to know he was desperate. His eyes were wide, his breath fogging up the window. He was shouting something, but I couldn't make out what. The snow muffled everything. "Please! Let me in! It's freezing out here!" he screamed, his fists pounding harder on the window. I froze. Something about the situation just didn't feel right. There was no way he'd just come out of nowhere. How long had he been standing out there? Where did he come from? And why was he so intent on getting inside my truck? I yelled back through the glass. "Sorry, man! I can't let you in. I'm waiting for a tow truck." But he didn't stop. He tried the door handle next, jerking it violently. The lock held, but the sound of the door rattling made my heart race. "Please, man! I'm begging you!" His voice was desperate, panicked. But there was something in his tone that made my skin crawl. It didn't sound like fear. It sounded like he was trying to convince me of something, like a bad salesman pushing a deal that was too good to be true. I didn't know what to do. Every instinct told me to stay locked in. My truck might have been overheating, but at least it was safe. The guy outside was losing it. He slammed his fists against the window again, harder this time, and for a split second, I thought he might actually break the glass. That was it. I didn't care if my engine was about to blow up. I turned the key, and the truck roared to life. I slammed my foot on the gas, and the truck lurched forward, wheels spinning in the snow before finally catching traction. As I pulled away, I caught one last glimpse of the guy through my rearview mirror. He was still standing there, hands outstretched, watching me drive off into the night. My heart was pounding, and I kept glancing in the mirror, half expecting to see him running after me, but he didn't. He was just gone. I should have felt relieved, but something didn't sit right. Why had he been out there? Where did he come from? And then it hit me. I hadn't seen any other cars for miles, except that Toyota earlier. Could it have been the same guy? I was still reeling from the shock of the encounter, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I navigated the winding road through the thickening snow. The truck's headlights cut through the flurries, but my mind was racing with anxiety. Each shadow cast by the trees felt ominous, and I was hyper-aware of every sound, the wind howling, the crunch of snow under the tires, and the engine sputtering ominously as I pushed it harder than I should have. As I drove on, I finally spotted the glow of headlights up ahead, and relief flooded through me. It was the tow truck, a beacon of safety amid the relentless storm. I pulled over, my heart still pounding, and jumped out to meet the driver, a burly man with a thick beard and a welcoming smile. "Hey there! Thought you'd be stuck out here forever," he chuckled, but I couldn't bring myself to laugh along. "What happened? Did you hit something?" "No, the engine just overheated. I was waiting for help when..." I hesitated, my voice trailing off as I considered whether to tell him about the man outside. "A guy came by, begging to get in. It was weird." The tow truck driver raised an eyebrow. "You don't want to let strangers in your vehicle, especially out here. People can be desperate, you know?" He didn't need to elaborate. I could see the wisdom in his eyes. As he hooked up my truck, I kept glancing back down the road, half expecting to see that man materialize out of the shadows again. But the snow was falling heavily now, masking any movement beyond the beams of our headlights. It was unsettling how quickly the atmosphere had shifted from calm anticipation to creeping dread. "All right, let's get you out of here," the driver said, pulling me back from my thoughts. "Where to?" "Stowe, just up the road," I replied, feeling an odd mix of gratitude and residual fear. The tow truck's engine roared to life, and as we drove, I tried to shake off the memory of that man, but the encounter gnawed at me like a persistent itch. The journey felt long, with the storm obscuring everything beyond the window. But the driver, Mike, was friendly and chatted about the local scene, his voice a comforting presence in the thick tension of the night. We drove through small towns, the occasional light flickering in the distance, the world outside transforming into a winter wonderland, illuminated by the soft glow of street lamps. As we finally pulled into Adam's cabin driveway, the sense of relief washed over me, but the memory of the man lingered. Mike helped me unload my stuff, and I thanked him again for getting me out of that mess. He waved it off, but I could tell he was a good guy, the kind who kept an eye out for others. I stepped inside the cabin, the warmth enveloping me instantly. Adam was already there, stoking the fire in the fireplace and pouring a couple of beers. "You made it! I was starting to think you'd be lost out there forever," he joked, his laughter echoing against the wooden walls. But as I settled into the cozy living room, surrounded by the familiar scent of pine and wood smoke, I couldn't shake the unease. The flickering light of the fire danced on the walls, creating shadows that seemed to breathe with a life of their own. I took a deep breath, trying to focus on the weekend ahead, but the thought of that man loomed large. "So, how was the drive?" Adam asked, looking at me over the rim of his beer. "Not great. The truck overheated about an hour out," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Had a run-in with some guy who wanted to get in my truck while I was waiting for a tow." Adam raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean? Was he just a hitchhiker?" "No, it was different," I said, recalling the man's desperate pleas and haunting eyes. "He was really insistent, and I just had this gut feeling not to let him in. I don't know, it felt off. I think he might have been trying to lure me into a trap or something." Adam frowned, his expression shifting from amusement to concern. "Dude, that's creepy. What if he was trying to rob you or something?" "Exactly!" I exclaimed. "But it gets worse. When I drove off, I saw the Toyota parked up the road, and I swear it looked like the same guy who'd just been begging to get in. I think he was waiting for me." A chill ran through the room, and Adam's face paled slightly. "Man, that's messed up. Are you sure you're okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine, just shaken up," I said, trying to brush it off. But deep down, I could feel the knot in my stomach tightening. The night wore on, and we shared stories and laughed, but every now and then, my mind would drift back to that man in the snow. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had escaped something sinister. I was 17 when I had my first girlfriend, Rachel. It was one of those high school romances, simple, sweet, and full of firsts. We were in our senior year, juggling school, part-time jobs, and the excitement of new love. Both of us worked during the day at a local grocery store, trying to save up some cash for college. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave us a bit of freedom, a little pocket money for dates. That Friday night, I remember feeling particularly happy. The work week was over, and we had the weekend ahead of us. I wanted to do something special for Rachel, but with my limited budget, I couldn't exactly take her anywhere fancy. So, I planned something modest. After our shifts ended, I picked her up, and we went to this cozy little diner near my house. It wasn't anything spectacular, just burgers and fries, but it was one of our favorite spots. We spent the evening laughing, talking about school, our friends, and whatever else came to mind. It was perfect in its simplicity. After dinner, I drove her back to her place, intending to call it a night. But as we pulled up in front of her house, neither of us wanted the evening to end. It was one of those moments when you feel like time is slipping away too fast, and you just want to hold on a little longer. So, I suggested we take a drive. It was late, the roads would be quiet, and I thought we could find somewhere peaceful to sit and talk. Rachel smiled and agreed. We set off, leaving the well-lit streets of the town behind, venturing into the outskirts where the roads were narrower, and the houses more spread out. Eventually, we found ourselves driving through a thick forest. I knew the area pretty well. There were some backroads that farmers and hunters used, and though I wasn't exactly sure where we were headed, I didn't feel worried. The night was clear, the stars were out, and everything seemed calm. At some point, the paved road turned into a dirt path. It wasn't the first time I'd driven off the beaten track, so I didn't think much of it. But I could sense Rachel was starting to feel uneasy. She kept glancing out the window, her fingers tapping lightly on her knee, a nervous habit of hers. I reached over, gave her hand a reassuring squeeze, and promised we wouldn't go too far. Then, out of nowhere, Rachel said she needed to use the bathroom. It wasn't exactly ideal, but we were miles from the nearest gas station, and I could tell by the look on her face that she didn't want to wait. I pulled the car over onto the side of the dirt road, turning off the engine. The forest around us was dense, the trees tall and imposing, their branches weaving together like a dark canopy above. We got out of the car, and that's when it hit us. A stench so foul, so overwhelmingly putrid, that it felt like we had walked into a wall of decay. Rachel gagged, covering her mouth, and for a moment I thought she was going to throw up. I tried to brush it off, making a joke about how someone probably had the same idea as us and used this spot as their personal bathroom. But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. There was something unnatural about that smell, something that didn't belong. Rachel was visibly uncomfortable, but she nodded, determined to get it over with. I told her to stay close to the car while I walked a bit further into the trees. The smell didn't fade the further I went, which was odd. I expected it to dissipate, but it hung in the air, thick and inescapable. After a few minutes, I hurried back to the car. We were both on edge now, ready to leave. But as we walked back toward the car, we heard it, a loud snap coming from somewhere to our left. The sound of a branch breaking. Rachel froze, her hand gripping my arm tightly. My heart raced as I scanned the darkness, trying to see what had made the noise. Maybe it was a deer, or some other animal, I thought. This was the woods, after all. Animals were bound to be out here at night. But then, we heard it again. This time, it was closer. Rachel whispered that we should get back in the car, her voice trembling. I didn't argue. I reached for the door handle, but before I could open it, a scream cut through the night. It wasn't just any scream. It was high-pitched, raw, and full of terror, a sound that clawed its way into my chest and settled there, gripping my heart in a cold fist. Rachel grabbed my arm, pleading with me not to go toward the sound. But something in me, call it curiosity or maybe stupidity, wanted to know what had happened. I told her to stay by the car, that I would just take a quick look. She begged me not to, but I couldn't shake the feeling that if I didn't check it out, we'd regret it. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees ahead. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to walk toward where I thought the scream had come from. I didn't go far, maybe just 10 or 15 feet, before I stopped. The smell was worse here, almost unbearable. My stomach churned, and I felt like I might vomit. Instead of going any further, I did the only thing that made sense in that moment. I lifted my phone and snapped a picture. I don't know why I thought it was a good idea at the time. Maybe I figured I'd capture something in the dark that I couldn't see with my own eyes. When the flash went off, I glanced at the screen. My blood ran cold. Standing there, in the distance, was a man. He wasn't doing anything, just standing still. He was wearing a white shirt with black stripes, the kind you'd see on an old-fashioned prisoner's uniform. Behind him, I could make out the shape of a tarp, hanging loosely between the trees. But it wasn't the man's stillness that scared me. It was his face, or rather, the lack of it. The flash hadn't captured any details. It was just a blank, pale shape where his features should have been. I didn't wait to see if he moved. I turned and ran back to the car, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might explode out of my chest. Rachel saw the look on my face and didn't ask questions. She knew something was wrong. I fumbled with the keys, finally getting the door open, and we sped off down the road, the tires kicking up dirt and rocks as we tore away from that place. The drive back was a blur. Rachel kept asking me what I'd seen, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her until we were safely back in town. Even then, I couldn't fully explain it. We pulled up outside her house, both of us shaken. I showed her the picture, and she went pale. She couldn't look at it for more than a few seconds before handing my phone back, her hands trembling. Neither of us slept that night. I ended up staying at her place, both of us too scared to be alone. What had we stumbled upon? To this day, I still don't know. It was the summer of 2011, and I was just shy of my 19th birthday. The air was thick with the lingering warmth of the season, and a sense of freedom coursed through my veins. I remember that night vividly. My best friend, Lydia, who was a couple of years younger than me, and I had decided to break the monotony of our rural Virginia lives. We'd spent the evening indulging in the small-town joys of life, dinner at the Waffle House, a few rounds of bowling, and aimless wandering through a local shopping center, our laughter echoing in the warm night air. As the clock ticked toward midnight, we still weren't ready to call it a night. With a mischievous glint in her eyes, Lydia suggested we take a drive on the empty backroads that wound through the countryside. After some light-hearted banter, I agreed, eager for adventure and a chance to escape the ordinary. We drove away from the familiar roads, the pavement giving way to gravel and dirt as we ventured deeper into the night. The headlights of my old Jeep illuminated the path ahead, casting eerie shadows on the trees that lined the road. The silence of the rural night was occasionally broken by the rustling of leaves and the distant calls of nocturnal creatures, giving the air a surreal quality. I felt a sense of thrill wash over me, an intoxicating mix of freedom and anticipation. As we navigated the winding, poorly maintained dirt road, I noticed a dim light flickering in the distance. Curiosity piqued, I slowed down, straining my eyes to see what lay ahead. As we drew closer, I saw a figure standing under the porch light of an isolated house, an odd sight for such a desolate area. The man was tall and lanky, his posture rigid as he stared directly at us. A shiver crept down my spine. "Do you see him?" I whispered to Lydia, my voice barely above a breath. "Yeah," she replied, her tone laced with unease. "What do you think he's doing out here?" We exchanged nervous glances, the weight of the stranger's gaze pressing on us like a physical force. There was something unsettling about the way he stood there, as if he had been waiting for us. But instead of turning back, we decided to carry on, chalking it up to the peculiarities of rural life. Once we made it back onto a familiar asphalt road, relief washed over us. I could feel Lydia's tension easing, her laughter ringing in my ears once more as we joked about the creepy man. But that relief was short-lived. A few minutes later, the headlights caught something unusual on the road ahead, causing me to slam on the brakes. I squinted, trying to make sense of the figure in the distance. As we approached, my stomach dropped. It wasn't an animal as I had initially thought. It was a woman, an elderly lady, disheveled and wearing tattered white clothes. Her long, tangled hair danced wildly in the breeze, adding to her eerie appearance. "Is she okay?" Lydia asked, her voice trembling. Before I could answer, the woman turned abruptly, her eyes wide and wild. She raised her arms, waving them frantically as if trying to catch our attention. Panic surged through me as I noticed the dark stains soaking her clothes, a vivid red against the pale fabric. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. "What the hell is happening?" I shouted, the urgency in my voice echoing through the Jeep. "Drive! Just drive!" Lydia screamed, her panic infectious. Without thinking, I hit the gas pedal, the tires screeching as we sped past the woman. I dared not look back. The image of her bloodied figure burned into my mind. My heart raced as we barreled down the road, fear clawing at my throat. We didn't stop until we reached the safety of the well-lit highway, the familiar hum of cars bringing a momentary sense of relief. But even as we navigated the familiar streets toward home, I felt the weight of dread lingering. The fear of the unknown gnawed at me. Who was that woman? What had happened to her? And why was she out there, alone and bloodied? In the days that followed, I found myself haunted by the memory. Lydia and I talked about it incessantly, replaying the events in our minds, trying to piece together the fragments of that terrifying night. We scoured local news for any mention of a missing person or a crime in the area, but there was nothing. The woman seemed to have vanished, leaving no trace but our terrified memories. Months turned into years, and life continued. I moved on, But that night was never far from my thoughts. It lingered in the background, a shadowy reminder of how fragile our safety can be. I got married and eventually settled down near the same area where we'd encountered the woman. Despite my routine drives on the familiar roads, I never encountered her again. But in early 2024, everything changed. News broke about a drug ring that had been operating in the very vicinity of that fateful night. The police had executed a major bust not far from where the man had stood under the porch light all those years ago. I couldn't shake the feeling that there might be a connection between the two events. What if the man had been guarding something sinister, something that led to the woman's condition? The question swirled in my mind, but I still lacked any concrete answers. As I drove those old roads daily, I couldn't help but wonder if I would ever find the truth behind that night. The mystery of the woman with the bloody clothes lingered, an unanswered question that hung heavy in the air. I knew one thing for certain: I never wanted to see her again. It was a warm summer night in late July when I found myself driving home after a long day at work. The clock read 12:15 a.m., and the moon hung high in the sky, casting a silvery glow over the empty roads. I was on a secluded highway, flanked by vast cornfields on one side and dense woods on the other. The wind blew gently through the open top of my convertible, carrying with it the earthy scent of the fields and the coolness of the approaching night. I always loved these late-night drives. There was something therapeutic about the solitude and the quiet, away from the chaos of daily life. I had my favorite playlist softly playing, and I was lost in thought, reflecting on everything from work stress to future plans. Suddenly, my tranquility shattered like glass. From the depths of the woods, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night air. It was a woman's voice, shrill and full of terror. I froze for a moment, my heart racing. I scanned the surroundings, trying to pinpoint the source of the scream. It seemed to echo, reverberating off the trees, making it impossible to determine its origin. After a moment's hesitation, I pulled over to the side of the road, my instincts kicking in. I grabbed my flashlight and the baton I kept in the back seat, just in case, and stepped out of the car. The night was eerily still, the chirping of crickets fading into silence as I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" Almost immediately, a desperate voice replied, "Please help me." It came from the woods to my left. A wave of adrenaline surged through me, and I took off in the direction of the voice, heart pounding in my chest. I was determined to find this woman and help her. As I plunged into the forest, the darkness enveloped me, the only light coming from my flashlight beam cutting through the night. I called out again, urging her to keep yelling so I could find her. "Just keep shouting! I'm coming!" I shouted back, pushing through branches and stepping over fallen logs. But as I ran deeper into the woods, an unsettling realization struck me. No matter how fast I moved, the sound of her cries remained at a constant distance. It was as if I was running in place, no closer to her than when I had first heard her. Panic began to creep in, twisting my insides. The thought flashed through my mind, what if this was a trap? What if someone was luring me into the woods? My instincts screamed at me to turn back, and just as I was about to do so, the screaming stopped abruptly. A heavy silence settled around me, and I felt an ice-cold shiver run down my spine. I had been trained to recognize danger, and every fiber of my being told me to retreat. I turned on my heel and sprinted back the way I came, the sound of leaves crunching underfoot echoing like a heartbeat in my ears. But the moment I began to run, the screams resumed, yet they sounded different this time. They were closer, more frantic, as if something was right behind me, pursuing me through the darkness. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be lurking just beyond my flashlight's reach. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I felt like a prey animal being hunted. When I finally burst into the clearing where I had parked my car, I felt a rush of relief. I didn't waste a second. I jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, heart racing as I turned the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I peeled away from the side of the road, tires screeching on the pavement. As I sped down the highway, I could still hear the echoes of her screams reverberating in my mind. I drove faster than I ever had before, feeling the cool night air whip against my skin. I wanted nothing more than to put as much distance between myself and that haunting forest as possible. When I finally reached the nearest town, I pulled over at a gas station, my hands still trembling as I reported the incident to the police. The officer on duty listened intently, taking notes, but I could see skepticism etched on his face. "You didn't see anyone? Just heard a scream?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "I swear I heard her. She was in trouble," I insisted, desperation creeping into my voice. But as I recounted the details, I couldn't shake the feeling of doubt that settled in my gut. What if I had imagined the entire thing? What if it was a figment of my overactive imagination, fueled by exhaustion and the solitude of the night? Despite the officer's assurances that they would investigate, I felt a gnawing dread in the pit of my stomach. I had lived in this town my entire life, but now it felt foreign, tainted by the horrors of the night. I went home, my mind replaying the events over and over, searching for any sign of rationality, but I found none. All I could think about was that woman's voice, filled with fear and despair. The next few days passed in a haze. I tried to go about my life, engaging with family and friends, but the nagging thought of that night never left me. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare, one I couldn't wake up from. The image of the woods loomed in my mind like a dark shadow, and every time I closed my eyes, I heard the echo of her pleas for help. Then, a week later, everything changed. I sat in my living room, flipping through the channels on TV, when a news report caught my attention. A woman's body had been discovered in the woods, not far from where I had heard the screams. My heart dropped into my stomach as I listened to the details unfold. She was identified as a 30-year-old woman named Grace, and there were no signs of struggle or foul play. It felt like the ground had fallen out from beneath me. I couldn't believe it. Could it be? Had my instincts led me to the last moments of her life? I remembered her voice, pleading for help, and the way it resonated through the night. A chilling realization settled in my bones. The scream I had heard wasn't just a cry for help. It was a last desperate attempt to escape a fate sealed in darkness. The possibility haunted me. What if I could have saved her? As the news continued, I could barely breathe. I felt an overwhelming guilt wash over me, mixed with a deep-seated fear. I had always thought of myself as brave, someone who would step up in a crisis, but I had turned back. What if my hesitation had cost her life? It was a thought I couldn't shake, a weight I would carry for the rest of my days. I've always loved coming to Maine for hunting season. There's something about the crisp November air, the quiet woods, and the chance to escape the noise of everyday life that draws me in every year. Normally, I stay at an Airbnb because buying a place for one annual trip doesn't seem practical. So, in November of 2022, like clockwork, I packed my rifle and gear, booked a cabin near a national park, and made the long drive from the city. It was a 5-hour drive through dark, winding roads, and by the time I pulled up to the cabin, it was well past midnight. I was tired, but the adrenaline of getting back into the wilderness kept me going. The cabin was small, a rustic little place tucked away just beyond the tree line. It was perfect for a hunting trip, remote enough to feel isolated but still within a short drive of the national park. The owner had left the key under the doormat as promised, and after fumbling with the lock in the dark, I stepped inside. The cabin was simple, one bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living room with a wood-burning stove. It smelled of cedar and pine, the kind of earthy, welcoming scent that immediately made me feel at ease. I set my bag down, took a quick look around, and decided I'd explore more in the morning. After a long day of driving, all I wanted was to collapse into bed and get some rest. The next morning, I woke up early. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm glow over the woods outside the cabin window. I brewed a cup of coffee, grabbed my hunting gear, and headed out, eager to get a good start on the day. I had a general idea of where I wanted to go, having scouted the area online beforehand. There were supposed to be good deer populations near a trail a few miles from the cabin. As I made my way through the woods, I could hear the crunch of fallen leaves beneath my boots, the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. It was peaceful. I'd been walking for about an hour when I heard something behind me. At first, I thought it might be an animal, maybe a deer. But when I turned around, I saw a man. He was older, maybe in his 60s, and wearing an old, worn-out jacket and a hunting cap. But there was something off about him. He wasn't carrying any hunting gear, just standing there, staring at me. "You can't hunt here," he said, his voice rough like gravel. I was taken aback for a moment. "I'm sorry, I thought this was public land," I replied, trying to keep my tone calm. "Not anymore," he said. "This area's off limits now. You need to leave." The way he said it wasn't a suggestion, it was a demand. Something about his tone made my skin crawl, but I nodded, not wanting to start a confrontation. "All right, I'll head out," I said, slinging my rifle over my shoulder. He didn't say another word, just stood there, watching me as I turned and walked back the way I came. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I glanced over my shoulder. He was still standing there, staring after me, unmoving. I picked up my pace, eager to put some distance between us. I made it back to my truck, deciding to drive to another park nearby. The whole encounter left a bad taste in my mouth, but I tried to shake it off. Maybe he was just some local who didn't like out-of-towners hunting on what he considered his land. Either way, I didn't want any more trouble. By midday, I returned to the cabin for a quick break, but something was wrong. As I approached the front door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. My heart skipped a beat. I distinctly remembered locking it when I left that morning. My mind raced. Had I forgotten? Or had someone else been here? I stepped inside cautiously. The cabin was quiet, but as I looked around, I saw that things were out of place. The chairs at the small dining table had been moved, and my bag, which I had left in the bedroom, was now on the floor, its contents partially spilled out. My wallet, phone, and other essentials were still there, so it didn't look like anything had been stolen, but the unsettling feeling from the woods returned with a vengeance. I checked every room, every corner of the cabin, but there was no one there. Whoever had been inside was long gone. My mind immediately went to the man I'd encountered in the woods. Could he have followed me? Had he broken in while I was gone? I locked the door and checked the windows, making sure everything was secure before heading back out to continue my hunt. But the rest of the day, my focus was gone. Every sound in the woods felt like it was someone watching me, lurking just out of sight. The peaceful solitude I had come to enjoy felt different now, tainted by the unease that was creeping under my skin. By the time the sun began to set, I hadn't seen a single deer. I decided to call it a day and headed back to the cabin. The sky was a deep orange as I parked the truck and made my way inside. Everything looked as I had left it, but the feeling of being watched lingered. That night, I tried to shake it off. I had a beer, made myself some dinner, and eventually started to relax. But as I prepared for bed, a noise stopped me in my tracks. It was subtle, just the faintest creak coming from the bedroom. I froze, listening intently. It came again, another quiet creak, like someone shifting their weight on the floor. I walked slowly toward the bedroom, my hand instinctively reaching for the rifle I had propped up against the wall. My heart was pounding in my chest as I pushed open the door. At first glance, everything seemed normal. The bed was made, my bag was still on the floor where I had left it. But then I saw it, something small, but unmistakable. The closet door was slightly ajar. I stood there for a moment, my breath catching in my throat. The closet door, which had been closed the last time I checked, was now cracked open just enough for me to see the darkness inside. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. Someone had been in my cabin earlier. I was sure of it. But was it possible that they were still here? Hiding? Watching? I slowly reached for the rifle, my hands trembling slightly as I wrapped my fingers around the cold metal. Taking a deep breath, I stepped closer to the closet, trying to silence the pounding of my heart in my ears. The creak of the wooden floor under my boots sounded deafening in the quiet cabin. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice firmer than I felt. No answer. I reached out with my free hand and grabbed the edge of the closet door. With a quick motion, I yanked it open, the hinges letting out a low groan. And there, crouched inside, was the man from the woods. He was hunched over, his eyes wide and wild, the same dirty jacket wrapped around him. For a moment neither of us moved. His face was twisted into a grotesque grin, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment, waiting for me to find him. I pointed the rifle at him, my hands shaking as adrenaline coursed through my veins. "Get out!" I demanded, my voice barely a whisper. But he didn't move. Instead, he just stared at me, that sickening grin still plastered on his face. My finger hovered over the trigger, and I was ready to do whatever it took to protect myself, but then, slowly, he stood up, raising his hands in mock surrender. I stepped back, keeping the rifle trained on him as I reached for my phone with my free hand. I dialed 911, my heart racing as I explained the situation to the operator. The man just stood there, his grin slowly fading into something more menacing, like he was toying with me. The operator told me that officers were on their way and to stay calm. Stay calm? I thought. How could I, with this man standing just a few feet from me, his eyes locked onto mine like a predator watching its prey? Minutes felt like hours as I stood there, the rifle heavy in my hands, never taking my eyes off the intruder. I kept the phone pressed to my ear, listening for any sign that help was on the way. Finally, I heard the distant sound of sirens. The man's grin faltered for the first time, his eyes darting toward the window as if considering his next move. But before he could do anything, the sound of footsteps on the porch told me the police had arrived. "Don't move," I ordered him, my voice stronger now. The door burst open, and 2 officers rushed in, guns drawn. They quickly subdued the man, who didn't resist, just kept that unsettling stare locked on me until they dragged him outside. I sank onto the bed, my body finally releasing the tension I had been holding onto for what felt like hours. The officers asked me questions, but I barely heard them. All I could think about was how close I had come to, what? I wasn't sure, but it scared me more than I wanted to admit. As the police car pulled away with the man in the back seat, I couldn't help but wonder how long he had been watching me, how long he had been planning this. And though I was relieved to have the gun, it was the unsettling realization that stayed with me, the thought that he had been waiting in that closet, hidden in plain sight, watching, waiting. I never found out how he got into the cabin, or what his intentions had been. But one thing was for sure, I wasn't coming back to Maine anytime soon. It was winter in northern Michigan, and the world outside our cabin was blanketed in a thick layer of snow. I was 14 at the time, excited for my first hunting trip with my dad and cousin, Sam. We were hunting deer, something I'd been hearing stories about for as long as I could remember. In my mind, hunting was a rite of passage, a moment that would mark my entry into adulthood. We had driven up early that morning in our beat-up old truck, hauling our gear and an ATV strapped to the back. The air was biting cold, and everything felt still, as if the world had frozen in time. We parked the truck and loaded up the four-wheeler, which rumbled and sputtered through the snow-covered trails until we reached the hunting ground. It was a remote area deep in the woods, far from any signs of life except for the occasional animal tracks. The day had started slow. We set up camp in a small hunting blind, huddled together in the cold, hoping to catch sight of a deer. Hours passed, the silence only broken by the occasional crack of a branch or the whisper of wind through the trees. I kept my eyes peeled, my heart pounding in my chest every time I thought I heard something moving. But nothing came. By late afternoon, the sun began to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows that stretched across the snowy landscape. "It's getting late," my dad said, his breath clouding the air in front of him. "We should pack up and head back before it gets dark." Sam nodded, already starting to stow his gear. I followed suit, packing away my rifle, somewhat disappointed we hadn't seen anything. But at least I had gotten the experience. As we began to move out of the blind, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it had become. The kind of quiet that felt unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. I was the last one out, lagging a few steps behind my dad and Sam as they headed toward the ATV. That's when I heard it, the soft crunch of snow behind me. At first I thought it was just one of us stepping on a patch of ice. But then it happened again, this time louder. I stopped, my breath hitching in my throat, and glanced over my shoulder. Nothing. Just the woods, dimly lit by the fading light. I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was probably a squirrel or some other small animal. We were in the middle of the forest, after all. Animals were everywhere. But as we continued walking, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The crunching sound started again, this time louder and closer. I stopped dead in my tracks and turned fully around, scanning the trees with my flashlight. My dad and Sam were still ahead, their backs to me, not noticing anything out of the ordinary. That's when I saw it. There, in the snow, was a set of fresh tracks. They were large, too large to belong to a deer or any other animal I could think of. The tracks looked like they had been dug into the snow, almost as if whatever had made them was dragging its claws. I felt a chill run down my spine, and not just from the cold. I called out to my dad, my voice barely above a whisper. "Dad, there's something out here." He didn't hear me at first, so I hurried to catch up with him. My heart was racing now, my breath coming in shallow bursts. I could hear the crunching again, closer this time, following me. Panic began to set in, and I broke into a jog, trying to reach my dad and Sam as quickly as possible. My flashlight beam danced across the trees as I ran, my boots crunching in the snow with every step. That's when I heard it, the sound that would haunt me for years to come. It was a scream, guttural and raw, echoing through the woods like something out of a nightmare. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely animal either. It was somewhere in between, a terrifying mixture of a bear's growl and the anguished wail of a person in pain. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The scream was so loud, so close, it felt like it was right behind me. I forced myself to move, to run, even though my legs felt like they were made of lead. I yelled for my dad and Sam, my voice barely cutting through the terror that gripped me. Finally, I reached the clearing where the ATV was parked. My dad and Sam were already there, their faces etched with confusion as they looked at me, wide-eyed. "What the hell was that?" Sam asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know," I gasped, struggling to catch my breath. "But we need to go." "No." They didn't argue. We jumped on the ATV, and my dad revved the engine to life. The roar of the motor drowned out the eerie quiet of the woods, and for a moment, I thought we were safe. But as we sped down the trail, heading back toward the cabin, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. That's when I saw it. Standing at the edge of the tree line was a figure, impossibly tall and gaunt. It was hard to make out in the darkness, but the silhouette was unmistakable, easily over 10 feet tall, with long, bony arms that hung at its sides. Its skin, if you could even call it that, was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. I blinked, hoping I was just seeing things, that it was some trick of the light. But it didn't disappear. It just stood there, watching us as we sped away. My heart pounded in my chest, and I fought the urge to scream. We made it back to the cabin in record time, the ATV skidding to a stop outside the door. I jumped off, feeling the bile rise in my throat as the fear overwhelmed me. I barely made it to the bushes before I threw up, the adrenaline finally catching up to me. My legs gave out, and I collapsed onto the snow, trembling uncontrollably. My dad ran over, concern etched across his face. "What the hell happened out there?" I could barely speak. All I could do was point back toward the woods, my voice shaking. Something followed us." He looked at me like I was crazy, but there was no denying the fear in my eyes. Even Sam, who was usually the first to brush things off, looked unsettled. We locked the cabin door that night, and I didn't sleep at all. I couldn't stop thinking about that thing in the woods, about the scream, about the tracks, and the figure I saw standing there, watching us. Whatever it was, I knew it wasn't an animal. And I knew deep down that it wasn't over. I woke up the next morning with a knot in my stomach, the events from the night before replaying over and over in my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure, tall, gaunt, and looming at the edge of the woods. My dad was already up, sipping his coffee by the cabin window, staring out at the trees like he was trying to convince himself that what I had described couldn't be real. Sam, on the other hand, had barely said a word since we got back. He just sat in silence, his usual carefree demeanor replaced with a distant, unsettled look. "Are you sure you weren't just seeing things?" Dad finally asked, breaking the silence. His tone was cautious, like he was trying not to scare me more than I already was. I shook my head, still feeling the icy grip of fear in my chest. "I know what I saw, Dad. It was huge, way bigger than any animal out here. And that scream. You heard it too, didn't you?" He looked away, frowning. "I heard something. Could have been a bear or a mountain lion, maybe. Sometimes they make noises like that." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to accept that it was just a bear, that my imagination had run wild in the darkness. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Something about those tracks, those glowing eyes, it was unnatural. Sam finally spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to go back and check it out." My heart dropped. The thought of going back into those woods, of seeing that thing again, made my skin crawl. "Are you crazy? I'm not going back there." But Sam wasn't backing down. "We have to. If there's something dangerous out there, we need to know. For all we know, it could be stalking the cabin right now." My dad sighed, rubbing his temples like he had a headache. "Look, we'll go back during the day. Whatever it was, if it's still out there, we'll figure it out. But we're not staying another night in these woods." That afternoon, after some convincing, we geared up and headed back out. I was reluctant, every step through the snow sending a fresh wave of anxiety coursing through me. My stomach was in knots, and I kept glancing around, expecting that thing to jump out from behind a tree at any second. The air was still cold, but this time it felt different, heavier. Like something was lurking just out of sight. We retraced our steps to the spot where I had first noticed the tracks. My flashlight beam cut through the dim winter light as I crouched down, my breath forming clouds in the freezing air. The tracks were still there, but now they seemed even larger in the daylight, the deep grooves in the snow suggesting something with claws. "Jesus," Sam muttered, staring down at the tracks. "That's no bear." We followed the trail further into the woods, the crunch of our boots the only sound breaking the eerie silence. The tracks led deeper than we had ventured before, into an area that felt wrong. The trees grew closer together here, their branches hanging low as if they were trying to trap us. The light was dimmer too, the thick canopy blocking out what little sunlight there was. Then we heard it again. That scream. It was distant this time, but unmistakable. The same gut-wrenching, bone-chilling sound we'd heard the night before. My blood ran cold, and I instinctively reached for the rifle slung across my back, gripping it tight. "What the hell is that?" Sam whispered, his voice shaking. "I don't know," I whispered back, my eyes darting between the trees. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, to get the hell out of there, but my legs felt glued to the ground. Dad stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "Stay close," he ordered, his voice low but steady. He was trying to stay calm for our sake, but I could see the fear in his eyes. Whatever was out there, it wasn't something he'd ever dealt with before. We continued following the tracks, though every step felt like we were walking into a trap. The further we went, the louder the screams became. They echoed through the woods, distorting and blending with the wind until it was impossible to tell where they were coming from. And then we saw it. In the distance, maybe 50 yards ahead, something moved between the trees. It was tall, taller than I remembered, with long, spindly limbs that looked like they shouldn't be able to support its weight. Its body was thin, almost skeletal, and it moved with an unnatural, jerky motion, as if it didn't belong in this world. I could barely make out its face, but what I saw made my stomach lurch. Its eyes, those same glowing eyes, stared directly at us, unblinking. Sam let out a string of curses under his breath, his hand gripping his rifle so tightly his knuckles turned white. "What the hell is that thing?" "I don't know," Dad whispered, his voice barely audible. "But we're leaving. Now." We turned and started walking back, trying to stay calm, but the thing, whatever it was, began to move. It followed us, its long limbs allowing it to cover ground faster than we could. My heart pounded in my chest as we picked up the pace, the crunch of snow underfoot growing more frantic. I dared to glance back once, and I wished I hadn't. It was closer now, moving faster. Its limbs twisted and bent in unnatural ways, like it was running but didn't quite know how. The glowing eyes never left us, locking onto us like a predator stalking its prey. Panic set in. We broke into a full sprint, the trees blurring past as we ran for our lives. I could hear it behind us, the thudding of its massive feet and the snow growing louder, closer. My lungs burned with each breath, and my legs felt like they were on fire, but I didn't dare stop. The cabin finally came into view, and I pushed myself harder, practically throwing myself toward the door. Sam and Dad were right behind me, and we all burst inside, slamming the door shut and bolting it behind us. We stood there, panting, listening. The woods outside had gone silent again, but the tension in the air was suffocating. My mind raced, trying to process what we had just seen, but there was no rational explanation. No way to make sense of the creature that had stalked us through the woods. Dad grabbed his rifle, loading it with shaky hands. "We're not staying here. We're leaving now." We packed up everything we could carry in a hurry, my heart still pounding in my chest. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me. But there was nothing. Just the quiet, empty woods. By the time we got back to the truck, it was dark again, and the sense of relief that washed over me when we finally drove away was overwhelming. But the feeling of safety was short-lived. Even now, years later, I can still feel it, the shadow that lingers, watching, waiting. I never went hunting again after that. I couldn't bring myself to step foot in those woods. Not after what we saw. My dad still doesn't talk about it, and Sam refuses to acknowledge it ever happened. But I know. I know what we saw, and I know it's still out there, lurking in the dark corners of those woods. Waiting. I'll never forget that Friday evening. It was one of those crisp autumn nights where the air had a bite, but not enough to be uncomfortable. The type of night that promised adventure, especially for someone like me, a 13-year-old kid eager for my next hunting trip. This particular trip felt special. My dad, Grandpa, and I were heading to our family's old hunting ranch in Alice, Texas. A sprawling 300-acre piece of land that had been passed down for generations. I'd been going there since I was 4, so every tree, every dip in the land, felt familiar. It was home, in a way. We arrived late in the afternoon, just before the sun dipped below the horizon. As usual, we parked the truck near the main cabin, a modest wooden structure that looked out onto acres of wild, untamed forest. I could smell the scent of pine and damp earth mixing with the faint whiff of barbecue smoke from our dinner earlier. We unloaded our gear, rifles, camo jackets, binoculars, and prepared for the next day's hunt. But before any hunting trip, there was always the tradition of sitting around the campfire. My grandpa, Jack, had already started the fire by the time I unpacked the last of my things. The crackling flames danced, casting long shadows across the open field, and the three of us settled into our usual spots, beers for them and a soda for me. Grandpa, with his thick white beard and weathered skin, told his usual stories of hunts from his younger days, when deer seemed bigger and more abundant. I listened, half engaged, because I'd heard these stories countless times before. It was peaceful, just the three of us and the sounds of the woods surrounding us. That kind of quiet where even the slightest rustle in the bushes could catch your attention. And that's when it happened. A sound pierced the night, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It was a scream. but not human. It wasn't an animal either, at least none that I knew of. It was high-pitched, guttural, almost like a woman wailing in agony mixed with the deep growl of a predator. My heart jumped into my throat. "What the hell was that?" I asked, looking wide-eyed at my dad and grandpa. They both sat frozen, their faces as confused and concerned as mine. "Could be a mountain lion," Dad muttered, although even he didn't seem convinced by his own words. "No way," Grandpa replied, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I've hunted mountain lions before. That ain't no mountain lion." The scream came again, this time closer. My skin crawled, and my mind raced with possibilities. What kind of animal could make a sound like that? And why was it so near? We grabbed our rifles and flashlights, the light beams cutting through the thick blackness of the forest edge. We stood, listening, waiting for any sign of movement. But nothing followed. The scream had stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving only the crackling fire and the whisper of the wind through the trees. After a long, tense moment, my dad shrugged, trying to shake off the unease. "Maybe it was a fox or something. Let's not let it ruin the night." But I couldn't relax. That scream stayed with me, ringing in my ears, even as the hours passed. We eventually went to bed, but I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind brushing against the windows made me jump. I kept thinking about that sound, about what could be out there in the dark woods, watching us. By morning, I was exhausted, but the hunting trip had to continue as planned. The next day, we woke up before dawn, the sky still inky black. My grandpa and dad went their separate ways to different blinds, while I was assigned to the one furthest from the cabin. My stomach churned with anxiety as I trekked through the underbrush with my rifle slung over my shoulder. Alone. I'd never been afraid to be out here before, but now, every rustle, every distant snap of a twig made my pulse quicken. That scream was still fresh in my memory, and the thought of whatever had made it was enough to make me second-guess every step I took. Finally, I reached my blind, an old wooden platform that sat high in a tree. I climbed up, settling into the small space, and set my rifle on my lap. I scanned the dark horizon with my night vision binoculars, expecting to see the usual, maybe a deer or a wild boar. But as the minutes ticked by, there was nothing. Not a single animal in sight. That was strange, considering how active this area normally was. I was about to chalk it up to bad luck when I saw it. A figure. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then it moved, slow, deliberate. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. It was standing on two legs, but it didn't move like a human. Its posture was wrong, hunched and awkward, like it was struggling to stay upright. My heart pounded in my chest as I focused the binoculars, trying to get a clear view. The figure was heading toward the tree line, just beyond the clearing where I was sitting. And then, suddenly it stopped. It turned its head toward me, and even though I was far away, I could feel its gaze. Cold. Hollow. Malevolent. Then it screamed. The same horrific, gut-wrenching scream from the night before. I froze. My hands were shaking, my mind racing with terror. Without thinking, I raised my rifle and fired. Once. Twice. Then I just kept pulling the trigger, the sound of gunfire ripping through the quiet morning. The figure didn't fall. It didn't run. It just vanished. 1 second it was there, and the next it was gone, like it had never existed in the first place. I sat there, panting, my heart slamming against my ribcage. My hands were slick with sweat, and my rifle felt heavy, too heavy, in my trembling hands. I waited, hoping that whatever it was wouldn't come back. But all that greeted me was silence. When my grandpa and dad finally returned to the cabin later that morning, I could hardly speak. My words came out in a panicked rush as I tried to explain what had happened, the figure, the scream, the shots I fired. I half expected them to brush me off, to tell me it was just my imagination running wild after a long night of strange noises. But instead, my grandpa's face went pale, and my dad's expression turned grim, like they knew something I didn't. For a long moment, the three of us stood there, the morning sun creeping higher into the sky, casting light on our tense little circle. My grandpa, who was usually the first to crack a joke or make light of things, stayed silent. His eyes were distant, staring into the trees as if he was looking for something, or maybe remembering something. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and rough. "I heard that scream before," he said, not looking at either of us. "A long time ago." A chill ran down my spine. My grandpa wasn't the type to scare easily. He'd fought in wars, hunted in the wildest parts of the country, and lived through more danger than I could imagine. But there was something in his voice now, something I'd never heard before, fear. Dad looked at him sharply. "What are you talking about, Pop?" Grandpa sighed and sat down on the porch steps, his rifle resting against his knees. "It was years ago, back when I was about your age," he said, nodding toward me. "I was out here with my dad, your great-grandpa. We used to come up to this ranch every hunting season, just like we do now. But one year, something happened." He glanced at me, his eyes dark and serious. "We were sitting by the fire one night, just like last night, when we heard it. That same scream. We thought it was an animal, too, but it didn't sound right. It was too human. So, we went to check it out." I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up as he spoke. Grandpa wasn't one for ghost stories or tall tales, so the fact that he was telling me this now, with that haunted look in his eyes, made my skin crawl. "What did you see?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head. "We didn't see anything, at first. But we kept hearing that scream, closer and closer every night we stayed here. Finally, one night, we spotted something out in the woods, just like you did. It looked like a man, but it wasn't. It was too tall, too thin, and the way it moved, it wasn't right. We tried to shoot at it, but no matter how many rounds we fired, it never went down. And then, just like that, it was gone." My dad crossed his arms, clearly trying to keep his cool, but I could tell he was rattled too. "So what did you do?" he asked. "We left," Grandpa said simply. "Packed up and didn't come back for years. Not until I figured it was safe again." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. The figure I had seen, was it the same thing my grandpa had encountered all those years ago? And if so, what the hell was it? Some kind of spirit? A creature? My logical mind wanted to dismiss it as a coincidence, maybe a hallucination brought on by fear, but deep down, I knew it was real. I had seen it. I had heard it. And it was still out there. "So what now?" I asked, my voice shaky. "What do we do?" Grandpa stood up slowly, his joints creaking with the effort, and slung his rifle over his shoulder. "We go hunting," he said, his tone grim but determined. "But this time, we stick together." The three of us geared up, more solemn than usual, and headed back out into the woods. The morning sun was higher now, casting long shadows across the landscape, but the air still felt heavy with unease. We moved quietly, scanning the tree line, listening for any sign of movement. The forest was eerily still, no birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. It was as if the whole world was holding its breath, waiting. Hours passed with no sign of the figure. I started to wonder if maybe it really had just been a bad dream, some figment of my imagination fueled by nerves and lack of sleep. But then, just as we were about to turn back, I heard it again. That scream. It was louder this time, closer, and it sent a jolt of terror through me. My grip tightened on my rifle as I turned to face the direction it came from. The woods seemed darker now, even in the daylight, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I scanned the area with my binoculars. There, just beyond the clearing. The figure. It was standing at the edge of the trees, half hidden by the shadows. It looked just as it had before, tall, thin, with an unnatural posture that made my skin crawl. But now, I could see it more clearly. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were empty, dark pits that seemed to suck in all the light around them. For a moment, none of us moved. We just stood there, frozen, staring at the thing that shouldn't exist. And then, without warning, it started toward us. Slow at first, then faster, its long limbs moving in jerky, unnatural motions. "Shoot!" my dad shouted, and the three of us raised our rifles and fired. The gunshots echoed through the woods, but the figure didn't stop. It kept coming, faster now, until it was almost upon us. Panic surged through me, and I fired again, this time aiming for its head. The bullet hit, but it didn't go down. Instead, it let out a deafening scream, louder than before, so loud that it made my ears ring. And then, just like last time, it vanished. 1 second it was there, and the next, it was gone, as if it had never been there at all. We stood there in stunned silence, our rifles still raised, waiting for it to reappear. But it didn't. The woods were silent again, but this time, it wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet. It was the kind that made your skin crawl, the kind that told you something was very, very wrong. "We need to go," Grandpa said, his voice shaking slightly. "Now." We didn't argue. We turned and hurried back to the cabin, our hearts pounding, our eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. But the figure didn't show itself again. Not that day, and not in the days that followed. We packed up and left the ranch that afternoon. None of us said much on the drive home, but I knew we were all thinking the same thing. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't finished with us. And I had a feeling that next time, we wouldn't be so lucky. It was a Friday night, and I was driving through Clearfield County, Pennsylvania. I had been visiting a friend in a nearby town, but as usual, I overstayed my welcome and left later than intended. The road ahead of me was a winding, 2-lane highway cutting through miles of dense forest. The kind of road where your headlights only reveal the pavement a few feet ahead before everything fades into darkness again. The occasional deer or raccoon darting across the road was the only sign of life. I always hated driving through isolated places like this at night. There's something unnerving about being completely alone in the middle of nowhere. The clock on my dashboard read 11:47 p.m. I still had about 40 miles to go before I'd be home. My gas tank was creeping towards empty, so when I saw a small, rundown gas station up ahead, I breathed a sigh of relief. The neon "open" sign flickered lazily in the window. It was one of those old-fashioned places, the kind that probably hadn't been updated in 30 years. The kind of place that didn't take credit cards and where the attendant was probably the only person around for miles. I pulled up to the pump and got out. The air was crisp, and the stillness of the night was unsettling. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, but I brushed it off as paranoia. I began to fill the tank, and that's when I noticed him, an old, battered pickup truck parked at the other end of the station, maybe 50 feet away. I hadn't heard it pull in. The driver, a scruffy man in his late 40s or early 50s, was leaning against the hood, smoking a cigarette and staring at me. His face was partially hidden by the brim of a worn-out baseball cap. I tried not to make eye contact, but I could feel his gaze burning into me. My hand tightened around the gas nozzle, and I prayed the tank would fill faster. There was something off about him, something I couldn't quite place. He seemed too calm for a man hanging out at a gas station in the middle of nowhere this late at night. When the tank was finally full, I replaced the nozzle and hurried inside to pay. The attendant, a bored-looking guy no older than 20, barely glanced at me as I handed him a crumpled $20 bill. I shot a quick glance outside. The man was still there, his eyes fixed on me, his cigarette now just a glowing ember between his fingers. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I rushed back to my car, quickly unlocked the door, and slid into the driver's seat. As I pulled away from the gas station, I couldn't resist one last glance in the rearview mirror. The man in the pickup was still watching me, standing completely still in the eerie glow of the gas station lights. I shook it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. There was no reason to think anything of it. He was probably just a local, hanging out at the only place open for miles. But as I continued down the dark, deserted highway, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. I drove for about 10 minutes when the car suddenly jolted to the side. The unmistakable thud of a flat tire sent my stomach dropping. I cursed under my breath and pulled over to the shoulder of the road. The thought of getting out of the car in this desolate place made me shudder, but I had no choice. Grabbing my phone, I switched on the flashlight and stepped out. The tire on the passenger side was completely flat, worse than flat. It looked like it had been slashed. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the deep, jagged cut in the rubber. There was no way this was an accident. Panic set in. I looked around, but there was nothing, just the dark woods on either side of the road. I grabbed my phone, dialed 911, and quickly explained the situation to the dispatcher. She told me to stay put and that a patrol car would be sent out, but it could take some time since I was in such a remote area. As I hung up, the sound of an engine approaching from behind made my blood run cold. I turned to see the headlights of a vehicle coming up the road. My heart sank as I realized it was the same old pickup truck from the gas station. I didn't wait to see if the man would stop. I bolted for the woods, ducking behind a cluster of trees. My breathing was ragged, and I could feel the cold sweat dripping down my back. From my hiding spot, I watched as the truck slowed down, its headlights sweeping the area where my car was parked. The truck came to a stop just a few feet from my car, and I saw the man step out. He didn't say anything, didn't call out. He just stood there for a moment, looking around as if he knew I was nearby. Then he pulled out his phone and made a call. His voice was low, but in the silence of the night, I could hear him clearly. "Yeah, it's done," he said, his voice casual, like this was all routine. "I'll handle the rest. Shouldn't be long now." I held my breath, trying to keep calm as my mind raced. Who was he talking to? What was he planning? My instincts screamed at me to stay hidden, but a part of me wanted to run, to get as far away from this man as possible. I could feel my pulse in my throat, pounding relentlessly as I crouched lower in the underbrush. Just as I was deciding whether to make a run for it, I saw another set of headlights approaching from the opposite direction. A second car was coming. I knew this was my chance. The second car's headlights grew brighter as it approached. My heart raced with hope. I had to make my move before the man in the pickup truck had a chance to do anything. Taking a deep breath, I bolted from the woods, stumbling slightly as I burst out of the tree line. The cool night air stung my face, but I didn't care. I waved my arms frantically at the oncoming car, praying the driver would stop. "Help! Please!" I shouted, my voice cracking from a combination of panic and exhaustion. The car, an older sedan, came to a screeching halt. The driver, a middle-aged woman, looked at me with wide eyes, clearly startled by my sudden appearance. I didn't have time to explain, so I just pointed toward the man by my car. "He slashed my tire! He's been following me!" I yelled, my voice trembling with fear. The man by the pickup truck turned around slowly, his expression calm, too calm. He didn't move toward me, didn't say a word. Instead, he just stood there, hands in his pockets, as if none of this was his concern. His lack of reaction made my skin crawl. The woman in the sedan hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting between me and the man. Then, thankfully, she unlocked the passenger door and gestured for me to get in. I scrambled inside, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely pull the seatbelt across my chest. "Thank you," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. The woman nodded, clearly still in shock herself. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white. She glanced in the rearview mirror, and for a moment, I thought she might say something, but the words never came. Instead, she hit the gas, and we sped off down the road, leaving the man and his pickup truck behind. I kept looking back, half expecting to see the old truck's headlights following us, but they never appeared. The road stretched ahead, winding through the dark forest, with only the occasional flicker of distant lights. The silence inside the car was deafening, broken only by the hum of the engine and the sound of my own ragged breathing. After what felt like an eternity, the woman finally spoke, her voice shaky. "Are you okay? What happened back there?" I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "I don't know," I admitted. "I stopped at a gas station, and that guy, he was there. He was just watching me. Then, not long after I left, my tire blew. It was slashed, I'm sure of it. And then he showed up again." She glanced at me, her eyes full of concern. "That's terrifying. Do you think he was trying to?" "I don't even want to think about it." I shook my head, unsure of how to respond. What had he been planning? Why was he just standing there, as if waiting for something? I didn't have answers, only an overwhelming sense of dread. We drove in silence for a few more minutes before the flashing red and blue lights of a police car appeared in the distance. Relief flooded through me. I wasn't safe yet, but at least now I had help. The woman pulled over, and I got out, waving down the officer as he stepped out of his car. His name tag read, Officer Hayward. And he was tall, with a no-nonsense look about him. His flashlight beam swept over me, then the car, and finally the road behind us. "Are you the one who called 911? He asked, his voice steady. "Yes," I replied, my voice still shaky. "That man in the pickup truck, he's back there. He slashed my tire. I think he was following me." Officer Hayward narrowed his eyes, looking down the road as if expecting to see the truck appear at any moment. He nodded once, then gestured for me to sit down in the back of his patrol car. The woman who had picked me up stayed nearby, her arms crossed, still visibly shaken. "Stay here," the officer said before heading back to his car. He grabbed his radio and spoke into it, likely calling for backup. After a few moments, he walked back to me. "All right," he began. "I'm going to head down the road and check on your car. I'll keep an eye out for the pickup truck. Sit tight." As he drove away, the night felt heavier, more oppressive. I was alone again, even though the woman was still there. We stood by her car, both of us glancing nervously down the dark road. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound of another vehicle approaching. My stomach clenched, but it was just the officer returning. When he stepped out, his expression was unreadable. "I found your car," he said. "No sign of the pickup truck though. Looks like he's gone." I exhaled a shaky breath. "What about the tire? Was it slashed?" He nodded. "It was. Pretty deep cut too. Whoever did it knew what they were doing." His eyes darkened slightly. "I'll write up a report, but there's not much to go on. The guy's gone, and without any more information, it's hard to say what his intentions were." That sent a shiver down my spine. What had his intentions been? Why did he just stand there watching? And who was he talking to on the phone? The officer took my information and assured me that he would keep an eye out for the truck in the area. He offered to call a tow truck for my car, and the woman, whose name I still hadn't learned, offered to drive me to a nearby motel where I could wait for the repairs. I thanked her, grateful beyond words that she had stopped when she did. As we drove away from the scene, the questions continued to swirl in my mind. Why had he targeted me? Had it been random, or had he followed me from the gas station for a reason? A few days later, I called the police station to follow up on the report. The officer who answered sounded confused. "There's no record of any report from that night," he said. "Are you sure it was Officer Hayward who helped you?" I froze. Hayward had been wearing a badge, a uniform, everything. But if there was no report, then who had he been? And what had really happened that night on that lonely road in Clearfield County? To this day, I never got an answer. The man in the pickup truck was never found. And sometimes, late at night, I still see those headlights in my mind, still feel that burning gaze from across the gas station parking lot. I escaped, but a part of me wonders if I was ever really meant to. Winter in New England can be brutal, especially during a storm. That night, as I drove along the winding roads blanketed in snow, the wipers of my old Subaru fighting a losing battle against the freezing sleet, I realized I wouldn't make it to Liam's place. We'd planned to spend the weekend together, but as the sky darkened and the storm grew more violent, it was clear I'd need to stop. The snow was coming down so fast I could hardly see more than a few feet ahead, and every mile brought a new patch of ice threatening to spin me off the road. My phone's GPS was useless, constantly recalculating as the signal wavered in and out. That's when I saw it, a small diner just off the highway, its neon sign flickering weakly through the snow. It seemed like an oasis of warmth and light in the middle of a white desert. I pulled in, the wheels of my car crunching over the icy gravel, and parked beside a beat-up truck that looked like it hadn't moved in days. Inside the diner, the warmth hit me first, then the smell, greasy food and stale coffee, with a faint undertone of cigarette smoke. There were only 2 other people inside, a grizzled older man in a thick plaid jacket hunched over a plate of fries, and a guy maybe a few years older than me sitting at the counter. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with sandy hair peeking out from under a beanie, and he looked like someone who spent most of his time outdoors. He caught my eye and smiled, a little too eagerly. I ordered a coffee, and before I could even think about asking where I might find a place to stay for the night, the guy at the counter, Toby, he introduced himself, was already offering suggestions. "You won't make it much further in this weather," he said, gesturing outside at the blizzard that was now in full swing. "There's a little motel just a mile down the road. Nothing fancy, but they've got heat and clean rooms. I'm headed that way myself." I hesitated. Something about his friendliness struck me as odd, too forward. But when I glanced back at the window, where the snow was swirling in angry gusts, the idea of pushing on any further seemed reckless. Plus, I figured, it was just a recommendation. I could make my own decision once I got there. "Thanks," I mumbled, sipping my coffee. "I'll check it out." Toby didn't leave right away. He sat with me for another few minutes, chatting about the storm, where I was from, where I was headed. I kept my answers short, not offering much. The whole conversation felt a bit off, like he was fishing for information, but maybe I was just being paranoid. When I stood to leave, Toby finally got up too. "See you at the motel," he said with another smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I didn't reply. The snow had already piled up over my car's tires by the time I left the diner, and it took a few nerve-wracking attempts to get the engine going. Following Toby's truck was easy enough. The road was empty except for us, and his taillights glowed like faint beacons in the snow. A few minutes later, we pulled into the lot of the motel he'd mentioned. It was one of those places that looked like it had seen better days, the kind where the paint on the sign is peeling and the lobby smells like mold. But it was shelter, and at that point, that was all I cared about. I parked my car and walked inside. The man behind the front desk was thin and tired-looking, his face drawn with lines that made him appear older than he probably was. He glanced at me without much interest as I asked for a room. "Single or double?" he asked, his voice rough. "Single, please." The room he gave me was on the 2nd floor, overlooking the parking lot. The walls were thin, and the heater rattled in the corner like it might give up at any moment, but at least it was warm. I was about to take off my coat when I noticed something strange. Across the parking lot, parked just a few spaces away from where I left my car, was an old sedan, its windows fogged up from the cold. I didn't remember seeing it there when I arrived. Then I heard the noise, a faint rustling sound coming from the bathroom. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I listened closer, I realized it was more than that. Someone was in there. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Who the hell could be in my room? I hadn't even been here long enough for anyone to follow me. Slowly, I backed toward the door, keeping my eyes on the bathroom. The rustling stopped, but I wasn't about to stick around to see who, or what, was in there. I bolted. I ran down the stairs, nearly slipping on the icy steps, and rushed to the front desk. The man was still there, looking as disinterested as before, like he'd seen it all 100 times. "There's someone in my room!" I gasped, out of breath. "In the bathroom!" The man blinked slowly. For a second, I thought he hadn't heard me. Then he sighed, reached for the phone, and dialed a number. But instead of calling the police, he muttered something into the receiver, something too low for me to hear clearly. A few minutes later, I saw Toby's truck pulling out of the lot. I watched as it disappeared into the night, my mind racing. Why had he left so suddenly? And why didn't the motel worker seem concerned? "Don't worry," the front desk guy said, finally hanging up the phone. "I'll give you another room. You'll be fine." I didn't feel fine. But what choice did I have? The storm outside had turned into a full-blown blizzard, and there was no way I could drive in that. Reluctantly, I took the new room key and headed upstairs again, trying to shake the sense of unease that clung to me like the cold. The second room was much like the first, basic, with the same rattling heater and thin walls. But this time, I locked the door and wedged a chair under the handle for good measure. Still, sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind against the window made me jump. Something wasn't right about this place. Something wasn't right about Toby, or the man at the front desk. I just couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I woke up with a start, disoriented. The pale morning light filtering through the thin motel curtains barely lifted the oppressive gloom that still hung in the air. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. Then the events of the previous night came flooding back. My pulse quickened, and I glanced toward the bathroom door, half expecting to hear those same unsettling noises again. But all was silent. I pushed myself out of bed, shivering as my feet touched the cold linoleum floor. My phone was dead, and I silently cursed myself for not plugging it in the night before. I needed to get out of here, but the blizzard from last night still raged, the wind howling against the windows. It seemed the storm wasn't going to give up anytime soon. I quickly dressed, my movements rushed and nervous. The memory of Toby's sudden departure, the motel worker's strange call, and that car in the parking lot weighed on my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. I was about to grab my keys and make a break for it, blizzard be damned, when curiosity got the better of me. I hadn't imagined those sounds coming from the bathroom. And I hadn't imagined that car appearing out of nowhere. But the question nagging at the back of my mind was, why? Who was in my room last night, and why hadn't the motel worker seemed alarmed? I approached the bathroom door, my heart pounding in my ears. I knew it was probably a bad idea, but I had to know. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, everything seemed normal. The small, dingy bathroom looked just as it had when I first entered the room. Grimy tiles, a rusty sink, a cracked mirror. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then I saw it. Behind the shower curtain, peeking out from the corner of the tub, was a piece of cloth, dark, soaked, and crumpled like it had been hastily shoved there. My stomach twisted. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before pulling the curtain back fully. There, lying in the bottom of the tub, was a shirt. It was drenched in something dark and sticky, something that looked an awful lot like blood. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled back, my hand trembling as I let the curtain fall back into place. What the hell was this? Suddenly, I couldn't stay there another second. Grabbing my things, I practically ran out of the room and down the stairs, heading straight for the front desk. But when I got there, the man from last night was gone. In his place was a woman, older, her face kind but worn. She greeted me with a smile that felt out of place given the circumstances. "Leaving already, Han?" she asked, her tone friendly. I tried to keep my voice steady, but I could hear the edge of panic creeping in. "Where's the guy who was here last night? The one who gave me my room?" The woman frowned, confusion crossing her face. "Guy? Sweetie, I've been working the desk all night. No one else has been here. You must be mistaken." My blood ran cold. "No, there was a man, older, thin, he gave me my key when I checked in." The woman shook her head, still smiling, but now it looked more like pity. "You must be tired. It was just me, all night." I felt dizzy, like I was caught in some kind of surreal dream. But the noises in the room last night, there was someone in the bathroom, and... I stopped myself. There was no point in explaining. She was looking at me like I was crazy. I didn't have time for this. All I wanted to do was get out of this place. I handed her the key without another word and rushed out the door into the biting cold. The snow was piled high, and the wind was still fierce, but I didn't care. I just needed to be away from that motel, away from whatever strange game was being played there. As I fumbled with my keys, trying to unlock my car door with frozen fingers, I noticed something else that made my stomach drop. The old sedan from last night was gone. It didn't make any sense. No car could have left in the middle of that storm without me hearing it. And yet, it was like the car had never been there at all. I stood there for a moment, heart racing, trying to figure out what was real and what wasn't. Had I imagined it? Had the whole night been some kind of fever dream brought on by exhaustion and fear? I didn't want to find out. I needed to put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. I slid into the driver's seat and turned the ignition. The engine sputtered for a moment, then roared to life, cutting through the eerie silence of the parking lot. As I backed out, I caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror, someone standing in the doorway of the motel, watching me. It wasn't the woman from the front desk. It was Toby. My hands clenched the steering wheel as I sped out of the lot, my heart hammering in my chest. What the hell was going on? Why was he still there? He'd left last night, hadn't he? I could still see his truck pulling out of the lot, his taillights disappearing into the snow. But then I remembered the blood-stained shirt in the bathroom. Had something happened after he left? Or had he never left at all? I drove as fast as I could without sliding off the road, the storm still raging all around me. I didn't stop. Not until I was miles away, on the main highway, the motel and its secrets fading into the rearview mirror. By the time I reached Liam's place, the storm had died down, and the sky was a dull, gray overcast. I was shaking, more from the adrenaline than the cold, but I couldn't explain any of it to him. How could I? He'd think I was losing it. But the truth was, I wasn't sure I hadn't. The following days were a blur. I tried to push the events of that night out of my mind, but the image of that blood-stained shirt kept haunting me, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw Toby standing there in the doorway, watching me leave. I finally decided to call the local police to ask if there had been any reports from the motel. They checked, but there was nothing. No suspicious activity. No missing persons. Nothing. It was like the whole thing had never happened. But I knew better. Something had happened at that motel, something dark. And as much as I wanted to move on, I couldn't shake the feeling that Toby, and the motel worker, whoever he was, had been involved in something far worse than just a late-night scare. The experience changed me. I've never trusted strangers the same way since. Every time I pass a motel on the side of a lonely road, I think about that night. And I wonder, who else has checked in and never checked out? It was mid-November, and I had a job interview that could potentially change my life. I'd been stuck in New York City for too long, working dead-end jobs and barely scraping by. When 2 companies in North Carolina offered me interviews within the same week, I felt like it was a sign. The thing was, I didn't have enough money to fly. Hell, I barely had enough for gas. But this was my shot, so I packed what little I had into my beat-up old car and hit the road for the nearly 10-hour drive. I left the city around 3 p.m., hoping to make it to North Carolina by midnight. The drive wasn't bad at first, the sun was still out, and I had some good music to keep me company. But as the hours passed, the sky turned a deep navy blue, and the highways became desolate stretches of black asphalt illuminated only by my headlights. By 9 p.m., I was starting to feel the exhaustion setting in, and I still had a few hours left to go. I thought about pulling over to take a break, but something inside me kept saying to push on. Then I saw him. It was subtle at first, just a figure on the side of the road as I sped by. A man in a suit, standing perfectly still. My headlights caught him just long enough for me to see his silhouette, a tall, thin man with his hands by his sides, not waving for help or trying to flag me down, just standing there as if waiting for something. I shook my head and blinked hard, chalking it up to the tricks my mind plays when I'm tired. Just a guy who needs a ride. I thought, though it was odd to see anyone in a suit at this hour, miles away from any town. I kept driving, trying to focus on the road ahead. But about 20 minutes later, there he was again. Same man, same suit, standing by the highway. This time, he was a bit closer to the road, almost in the lane. I swear, it was like he was facing my car directly. My heart raced as I passed him. I glanced in my rearview mirror, expecting to see his figure fade into the distance, but the darkness swallowed him whole. I told myself I was just tired. I mean, how could it be the same guy? I was going 70 miles per hour. There's no way he could have gotten ahead of me. Maybe it wasn't even the same man. There are lots of guys in suits, right? But the gnawing feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. I turned up the music, hoping to drown out the eerie feeling creeping up my spine, but my mind kept replaying the image of that man standing so still. There was something off about him, too stiff, too calm, like he didn't belong out there on the side of the highway in the middle of the night. Another hour passed, and I was starting to feel desperate for a break. I spotted a rest area sign up ahead and decided to pull over, hoping a strong cup of coffee would shake off the creeping paranoia. The place was deserted, as I expected for this time of night. Just a few trucks parked in the distance, their drivers probably fast asleep in their cabs. I parked near the vending machines and made my way toward the coffee dispenser, my eyes darting around the dimly lit area. That's when I saw him again. Standing under one of the streetlights was the man in the suit. He wasn't moving, wasn't walking toward me, just standing there, bathed in the dull yellow light like a shadow brought to life. My breath caught in my throat. It felt like he was staring right at me, though I couldn't make out his face from where I stood. I fumbled with the coins in my hand, dropping one on the ground as my fingers trembled. Every instinct told me to get back in my car and leave, but I forced myself to keep going. "It's not real," I muttered under my breath. "You're just tired. It's a coincidence." After grabbing my coffee, I made my way back to the car, my eyes flicking nervously toward the man every few seconds. He hadn't moved. Still just standing there, as if waiting for something. I got into my car and locked the doors, feeling a surge of relief. I took a sip of the coffee, but it did little to calm my nerves. My hands were shaking so badly that I spilled some on my lap. I was too scared to wipe it off. I couldn't stay there any longer. I turned the key in the ignition and pulled out of the parking lot, my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. He was still there, standing under the streetlight as I drove away, the yellow glow fading into the night. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my mind raced with thoughts. Was I losing it? Was this some sort of hallucination from the stress of the interviews? I didn't know, but I needed to get out of there. I kept driving, but the tension in my chest didn't ease. I decided to pull into a random parking lot a few miles down the road to take a nap. I was beyond exhausted, and I figured some sleep would help clear my head. I parked in the far corner of a dimly lit lot, reclined my seat, and closed my eyes, praying that when I woke up, everything would make sense. That's when the nightmare began. It started with a sensation of being watched. I opened my eyes slightly, just enough to see the outline of my car's interior in the dark. Then I saw it, a figure in the rearview mirror. The man in the suit was sitting in the back seat of my car. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. His face was shadowed, but I knew it was him. The same suit, the same unnerving stillness. He wasn't moving, just sitting there like he belonged. I screamed. I must have blacked out, because the next thing I remember is waking up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, the car eerily quiet. I whipped around, expecting to see him there, but the back seat was empty. The parking lot was silent, and the only sound was my own ragged breathing. I sat there for a long time, trying to calm myself down. It had to be a dream. A hallucination. There was no other explanation. I rubbed my eyes and checked the time. It was nearly 5 a.m., and I had to get to my interview. There was no time to dwell on what had just happened. But the image of him sitting in my back seat stayed with me. It felt too real. Too vivid. I started the car and got back on the highway, trying to shake off the lingering fear. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I wasn't alone. By the time I rolled into Raleigh, it was 8 a.m. I had just enough time to freshen up at a gas station before heading to the first interview. My hands were still trembling from the night's events, but I forced myself to focus. This interview was too important to mess up over some lack of sleep or, worse, a hallucination. I kept telling myself that the man in the suit was a figment of my tired mind, nothing more. As I approached the downtown office building where the interview was being held, the hustle and bustle of the city helped distract me, at least momentarily. The streets were full of people heading to work, faces I could focus on, all living their regular lives. It helped me feel grounded again. I parked, grabbed my portfolio, and gave myself a once-over in the mirror. I looked like hell, bloodshot eyes, dark circles, the works. But I had no choice. I needed this job. When I walked into the building, the receptionist directed me to the 5th floor. My stomach was in knots. I took the elevator up, mentally rehearsing my answers to every possible question they might throw at me. The doors opened, and I stepped into a sleek, modern office with glass walls and chrome accents. A woman at the front desk smiled at me, then led me to a conference room where I was supposed to meet the hiring manager. As I sat there, I went through my notes one last time, trying to shake off the exhaustion that still clung to me like a wet blanket. The door opened, and I stood up, plastering on my best professional smile. That's when I saw him. The man in the suit. I froze, my blood running cold. It wasn't just someone who looked like him, it was him. The same black suit, the same thin frame. His face was clearer now in the daylight, but it did nothing to ease the terror rising in my chest. He had high cheekbones, a sharp jawline, and cold, dark eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. His mouth curled into a smile, but it wasn't friendly. "Good morning," he said, his voice smooth but with an edge that sent shivers down my spine. "I'm Mr. Armitage. Shall we begin?" I stood there, unable to speak. My mouth had gone dry, and my heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. How could this be happening? The same man I'd seen on the highway, in the rest stop, and in my car was now standing in front of me, introducing himself as the person interviewing me for a job. I managed to stammer out a greeting and shook his hand. His grip was cold, almost too cold, like he'd just come in from a freezing winter night, even though the day outside was warm and sunny. My head was spinning, and I could barely focus on what he was saying as he gestured for me to sit down. The interview started, but I was barely present. I could hear him talking, asking me the usual questions about my experience, my goals, and how I would fit into the company, but I couldn't focus on the words. All I could think about was the fact that this man, the man I'd seen on the road, the man I had dreamed of sitting in my back seat, was real. He wasn't a hallucination. He wasn't some product of my sleep-deprived mind. Or was he? As I sat there, nodding along to his questions, I started to doubt myself again. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe the man on the highway had just been some random guy, and this was all a coincidence. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. His eyes never left mine, and I felt like he was studying me, reading every nervous twitch, every uneasy breath. The interview dragged on for what felt like an eternity. My answers were robotic, disjointed. I could see the disappointment in his eyes as I stumbled over basic questions. It was clear that I wasn't making a good impression, but I couldn't bring myself to care. I just wanted to get out of that room, away from him. When it was finally over, I stood to leave, practically running out of the conference room without a second glance. I heard him call after me, "We'll be in touch," but his voice seemed to echo in my ears, as though coming from a great distance. I bolted out of the building and into the fresh air, gasping like I'd been holding my breath for hours. My hands were shaking again, and I realized I'd left my portfolio in the conference room. But there was no way I was going back in there. I didn't care about the job anymore. I just needed to get away. I sat in my car for a while, trying to calm down. I had another interview that afternoon with a different company, and I knew I couldn't afford to screw that one up too. After a few deep breaths, I managed to get my mind in order. Whatever had just happened, I told myself it was over. Maybe the stress of the drive and the sleepless night had played tricks on me, but I had a second chance now. I couldn't let this one slip away. The second interview was in a smaller office on the other side of town. As soon as I walked in, I felt a wave of relief. The atmosphere was different, warmer, more inviting. The receptionist greeted me with a genuine smile, and when the hiring manager came out to meet me, he was nothing like the man in the suit. This time, I nailed it. My answers were sharp, my mind clear. The anxiety that had gripped me all morning seemed to fade away, and for the first time in hours, I felt like myself again. The interview ended on a high note, and I left the building with a sense of cautious optimism. Maybe things were turning around. That night, I checked into a cheap motel just off the highway, too exhausted to drive back to New York. I collapsed onto the bed, my body heavy with fatigue, and let sleep take me. But it wasn't a peaceful sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. The room was pitch black, and for a moment, I couldn't tell if I was still dreaming. Then I heard it, a soft, shuffling sound, like someone moving around in the darkness. I sat up, straining my ears. The noise was faint but unmistakable. I reached over to turn on the lamp, but my hand froze halfway. There, standing in the corner of the room, was the man in the suit. He wasn't moving, just standing there, his dark eyes locked on me. My body went rigid, the fear so intense I could barely breathe. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. He stepped forward, his polished shoes barely making a sound on the carpeted floor. Slowly, deliberately, he walked to the side of the bed, standing over me. His face was shadowed in the dim light, but I could feel his eyes boring into me. Then he leaned in close, his cold breath brushing against my ear. "We'll be in touch." I bolted upright, gasping for air, and flicked on the light. The room was empty. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could barely think straight. I searched every corner of the room, convinced that he had been there, but there was no sign of him. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I got a call from the second company. They offered me the job. I accepted, but I didn't move to North Carolina. I couldn't. Even after accepting the job, I couldn't bring myself to move to North Carolina. I made excuses to the company, asked to work remotely, and eventually, they agreed, though not without some reluctance. At first, I told myself it was because I needed more time to settle my affairs in New York. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was terrified of what, or who, might be waiting for me if I went back. It was one of those nights in South Jersey where the mist clung heavy to the roads, thickening the shadows between the trees on either side. I was working the night shift, patrolling my usual route down the rural highways. The call log had been quiet for hours, which in this part of town was either a sign of peace or a promise of trouble brewing. It was around 3 a.m. when I noticed it, a car, parked just off the road, skewed awkwardly on the grass. What struck me first was that the driver's side door was open. No one leaves a car like that in the dead of night, especially not in the middle of nowhere. The street was unlit, only the pale moonlight cut through the thick fog rolling from the woods on either side. As I slowed my cruiser and pulled up behind the vehicle, I saw someone. A figure, barely visible in the dim light, stepped out from the passenger side and bolted into the trees, disappearing into the thick shadows without a backward glance. Something gnawed at me, an instinct, maybe, or the uncomfortable chill that had taken root in my spine. I reached for the radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Reed. Got a vehicle, no plates, driver fled on foot into the woods. Requesting backup." Static crackled back, followed by an affirmative response. It would be a few minutes before anyone could get here, so I figured I'd better check out the vehicle in the meantime. My flashlight cut through the dense night as I approached, each step accompanied by a growing sense of dread that I couldn't quite shake. Peering into the car, the first thing that hit me was the smell. A thick, choking stench, rotten, stale, heavy. The kind of smell that clings to your clothes long after you've left the scene. I knew that scent. I had encountered it on the worst days of this job. It was the smell of something dead, something decomposing. Then I saw them. Crumpled tissues and paper towels lay scattered across the passenger seat, smeared with what looked like dried blood. Not just a few drops. These were soaked, the reddish stains so dark they were nearly black. The front seat was littered with them, some even strewn across the back. The amount of blood I was looking at suggested serious harm, or worse. And then, from somewhere in the trees I heard it. A soft, eerie rustle, followed by the crunch of leaves, and then, a voice. Low, guttural, like someone trying to speak underwater. I couldn't make out any words, but the tone was unmistakable. It sounded like someone in pain or in some other, darker state. The voice was too low to make sense of, but the intent chilled me. Do you need help? I called out, shining my flashlight into the murk between the trees. Silence. The only reply was the oppressive quiet of the forest and the occasional rustle of leaves. I radioed for more backup. Whatever this was, I was certain now that I was going to need all the support I could get. Just as I thought I'd seen the worst of it, something else caught my eye on the floor by the driver's seat. A bundle of what looked like a large cloth, soaked through with blood. I steeled myself, lifting it carefully with a gloved hand, and the cloth came away with a damp, heavy resistance. When I unwrapped it, I froze. There, lying cold and lifeless in my hands, was a severed hand. The edges were ragged, as though it had been hastily cut or torn away. Blood had congealed around the wrist, forming dark, hardened clots. I stumbled back, adrenaline surging through me, my heart hammering in my chest. This was beyond anything I had ever seen in my years on the force. I pulled my radio close, speaking quickly, my voice barely steady. Dispatch, this is Reed. I've found a human hand. Severed. The situation is potentially homicidal. Immediate assistance required. While waiting for backup, I continued to search the vehicle. Apart from the blood-soaked tissues in the hand, there was little else of note. No wallet, no ID, no clues that might tell me who had left this macabre scene behind. The car was confirmed stolen from a nearby town, but when I reached out to the owner, she had no idea who might have taken it. She hadn't even noticed it was missing. When backup finally arrived, we combed through the woods with flashlights, tracking dogs, and all the manpower we could summon in the dead of night. The dogs led us in circles, stopping short of anything useful. Hours passed, the dawn creeping over the treetops, yet we found no trace of blood leading from the vehicle, no further evidence, no footprints, and certainly no sign of the driver. It was as if the person had vanished into thin air, swallowed up by the forest itself. Forensics took over the vehicle, and they ran prints and DNA from the severed hand. The results were baffling. The fingerprints didn't match any on record, and there was no DNA match in any database. It was as if this hand had belonged to someone who didn't exist, someone with no history, no background. Weeks passed, then months, and every lead evaporated. The case went cold, and we were left with nothing but unanswered questions. I could feel the weight of the night bearing down on me as I took my seat for another graveyard shift at the Bergen County Police Department. The air inside the station was still, almost too quiet, like the kind of calm that only comes before a storm. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, almost mocking my boredom, and I settled in, half hoping the night would pass without incident. But that was rarely the case. Sometime around 2 in the morning, the call came in. A frantic voice on the other end of the line reporting screams coming from a house out near the edge of town. It was one of those calls that sets your adrenaline going even before you've left the station. I knew I'd be alone on this one, at least until I could call in backup. I drove the familiar winding roads, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The house was a 2-story place, tucked back from the road, shrouded in the shadows of tall, overgrown trees that loomed like sentinels. Everything about it felt wrong. The windows were dark, no lights inside, but there was one thing that caught my eye, a single window at the back, slightly ajar. I parked the cruiser, grabbed my flashlight, and radioed in for backup. The waiting silence around me was almost deafening. When I got closer to the house, the unease grew stronger. The front door was locked, as were the windows on the main level. But the one in the back, open just a crack, was practically inviting me inside. I climbed through, careful not to make too much noise, and landed softly on the carpeted floor of what looked like a living room. The air was thick with a smell I couldn't place, something stale, mingled with a faint metallic tinge. I called out, my voice barely louder than a whisper. "This is Officer Thompson with the Bergen County PD. Is anyone home?" Nothing. Just that oppressive silence. My flashlight scanned the room, revealing little more than outdated furniture, the edges gathering dust, and a few family photos on the wall, barely visible in the shadows. I moved through the ground floor, one room at a time. Kitchen, empty. Dining room, empty. Den, nothing but an eerie quietness. It wasn't until I reached the staircase that I heard something, a soft, almost imperceptible creak from above. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to stay calm. It could have been anything, a draft, an old floorboard, maybe even an animal. But deep down, I knew it was something more. Taking each step cautiously, I made my way up the stairs. The second floor was dimly lit by a faint glow spilling in from a streetlight outside, casting elongated shadows along the narrow hallway. 4 doors lined the walls, each closed. I held my breath, my grip tightening on the flashlight as I moved closer. Another creak came from behind the door at the end of the hall. I paused, heart pounding, and took a deep breath before slowly turning the handle. The door opened with a soft groan, and the smell hit me first, iron and something sharper, something unmistakably wrong. My flashlight fell upon the bed, and I froze. A woman lay there, her face pale, blood seeping through the blankets that covered her. Her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, and her eyes fluttered open, wide with fear. She'd been stabbed, multiple times, judging by the red stains that had soaked through the sheets. "Ma'am, stay with me," I whispered, moving closer. "I'm calling for help." But something made me stop. A sound, so faint I almost missed it, a rustling coming from beneath the bed. I swallowed hard and crouched down, my flashlight angled just so, to peer underneath. There, lying in the shadows, was a man, his face obscured by a cheap, expressionless mask, his body coiled like a predator waiting to strike. The flashlight beam caught his eyes behind the mask, glinting with something cold and unhinged. Without a second thought, I drew my weapon, aiming it directly at him. "Get out from under the bed. Now." He didn't move. I could see his chest rising and falling, hear the faint, controlled breaths he was taking. I repeated myself, voice as steady as I could make it. "Hands where I can see them, now." Slowly, he started to move, unfolding himself from under the bed in one fluid, unsettling motion. He stood, looming taller than I'd expected, and I kept my gun trained on him as he took a step back toward the corner of the room. "You stay right there," I ordered, the gun feeling heavier in my hands than it ever had before. He didn't resist, just stood there, his masked face turned toward me, watching with an unnerving stillness. The woman on the bed let out a weak moan, and I forced myself to focus, my gaze flickering between her and the man in the mask. The minutes stretched out, each one feeling like an eternity, until finally, I heard the blessed sound of sirens approaching. Backup was here. When my colleagues arrived, we officially cuffed the man and tended to the woman. She was barely conscious but still breathing. I remember looking at her pale face as the paramedics lifted her onto a stretcher, wondering how anyone could survive something like that. Later, as we took the man into custody, the story began to unfold. He was her boyfriend, or had been, until recently. He'd found out she was seeing someone else, a mutual friend, and in his twisted mind, he saw only one way to resolve the betrayal. He'd waited until he was certain she was alone, breaking in and confronting her, hoping to scare her at first, maybe only to make her feel the pain he felt. But rage had taken over, and things escalated. When she tried to end things over the phone earlier that night, he'd snapped completely. In that dark room, he became someone else, someone willing to do the unthinkable. And yet, even after all that, she lived. It was nothing short of a miracle. The doctors later told us she'd been stabbed 6 times, each one intended to end her life, but somehow she'd held on. I think back to that night sometimes, to the moment I found her, and the way my heart stopped when I saw him under the bed, hiding in the shadows, waiting. The image of his eyes behind that mask still haunts me, that sick gleam that told me he'd been ready to kill again if anyone got in his way. That night taught me the fragility of life, the thin line between safety and danger. It also reminded me of the darkness that can lurk in anyone, hidden just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. It was late, and I'd been patrolling the quieter part of town, where things are usually so calm that the night drags on. But just as I was about to wrap up my shift, dispatch radioed in. There was a call from a woman, young and living alone. She'd reported a break-in, a window smashed downstairs, though nothing seemed to be missing. What struck me odd was how nervous the dispatcher sounded. They told me the call had abruptly cut off. The woman, Kara, they said, hadn't picked up since, and any attempts to call her back went straight to voicemail. I drove to her address, a 2-story house set back from the road, with a cluster of trees crowding around it, giving it an eerie feel under the streetlight. The silence out here was thick. No movement, no sound. Not even a dog barking. I parked a bit away from the house, switched off the headlights, and approached the front door. I knocked several times, calling out, "Police! Kara, it's Officer Mason. Are you okay?" No answer. Just the faintest rustle in the air. Walking around the side of the house, I found a window smashed. A small, tight window leading into what looked like a basement or storage room. Glass littered the ground, shining in the moonlight like a scattered handful of broken stars. I had a choice. Protocol would say I wait for backup, but something didn't sit right with me. This didn't feel like a typical break-in. The quiet was too loud, too complete. And Kara, well, she could be in danger. I climbed through the broken window, careful to step over the shards, my heart thumping louder than I'd ever admit. Once inside, I drew my gun and announced myself, loud and clear. "This is the police. If anyone's here, show yourself." No response. Moving through the downstairs area, I noticed the furniture looked undisturbed. Nothing was overturned, no signs of rummaging. Odd for a break-in. I kept sweeping each room, moving carefully but quickly. That's when I heard it, a faint creak, the kind of sound that travels through walls, through floorboards, especially in older houses like these. The sound came from above. Upstairs. I felt my pulse quicken. Kara had mentioned hearing footsteps before the call cut off. I took a breath, quieted my nerves, and slowly ascended the staircase, keeping my steps light and my senses sharp. The upstairs hallway stretched out before me, dimly lit from a single lamp in the far room. I could see her bedroom door ajar, a soft glow of light spilling out onto the carpet. I approached, peering in cautiously, and found her, sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, face pale as moonlight. Her eyes snapped up to mine, wide and terrified, like a deer caught in headlights. "Kara?" I whispered, lowering my gun slightly. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, not speaking, not even breathing it seemed, just sitting there, tense and frozen. When I asked her why she didn't respond to the calls, her voice came out barely above a whisper. I didn't want him to know," she stammered. "I thought he'd hear." My stomach twisted. She wasn't alone. And whoever had broken in was still here. I glanced around the room, searching for any signs of movement, a shadow that didn't belong. But everything seemed still, eerily so. I gestured toward the closet, and her eyes darted there momentarily, before her gaze dropped to the floor, settling just beside the bed. I felt a chill run down my spine as I followed her gaze. She gave the faintest nod, just enough for me to understand. Someone was hiding beneath her bed. My mind raced. I couldn't let on that I knew, and I had to get her out of there without triggering any suspicion from whoever was lurking below. Thinking quickly, I asked her to come with me to fill out a report. Told her I needed her signature on some paperwork downstairs. She caught on immediately, standing slowly. I could see her hands trembling as she moved, her eyes never leaving mine as she approached. I stepped aside, letting her slip past, and the second she was clear, I spun back to the bed, gun drawn. "Come out, now!" I barked, voice carrying the weight of authority, trying to mask the slight shake in my hands. Silence. And then, from the shadowy depths beneath the bed, a shuffling sound, slow and deliberate. A man, dressed in all black, slid out on his stomach, hands raised, a glint of something metallic in his grip. I barked another order, and he dropped the weapon, a small handgun, that clattered onto the floor. He was middle-aged, unshaven, with a hollow, wild look in his eyes. The kind of look that makes your blood run cold. Backup arrived shortly after, and the man was cuffed, taken out into the night while Kara stood in a daze, watching from the doorway, her face pale and drained. I stayed with her as she spoke to another officer, recounting how she'd discovered the broken window, how she'd hoped it was a fluke until she started hearing the footsteps, those slow, creeping footsteps that had haunted her from below while she huddled in fear. She explained, too, why she hadn't answered when we tried to call back. She was afraid her voice would carry. Afraid that he'd realize she wasn't alone in her fear. The thought that her silence, her deliberate calm, might have kept him from acting sooner hit me hard. As I left her house that night, walking through the quiet, empty rooms one last time, I thought of the man hiding under her bed, lurking just inches away as she sat above him, terrified.